I was 24 when my Nana passed away. She had always been a quiet, private woman, keeping to herself in a small house tucked deep in the forests of northern Vermont. I didn't go there much when I was a kid. My folks preferred city life, and they weren't fond of the isolation. Still, I'd been there a few times, enough to remember the thick woods and the strange silence that seemed to hang in the air. When she died, the house was left to me. First, I thought about getting rid of it. What would I do with an old wooden home so far from everything? But eventually, curiosity pulled me in. I felt the need to see it again, to go through her things, maybe learn something new about her past. I made the trip in late November. Looking back, it wasn't the smartest idea. The first snow had already started, and the roads weren't in great shape. By the time I got to the property, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin looked just like I remembered it. Small and worn down, with a sagging porch and a rusted tin roof. The air was icy, and aside from the occasional rustle of dead leaves, the woods were still. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and stepped up onto the porch, which groaned under my weight. My dad had told me where the key would be, beneath a loose plank beside the door, and it was right where he said. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and dry wood. There wasn't much furniture. A beat-up sofa, a small wooden table, and a cast iron stove in the corner. I could see my breath when I exhaled. The place hadn't been warmed in who knows how long. I started a fire and unpacked a few basic supplies I'd brought along. As the heat slowly filled the room, I began looking around. Most of the furniture had sheets thrown over them, and the cupboards were full of old canned food with labels too faded to read. I came across a pile of newspapers from the late 90s and a small shelf of books, mostly crime novels and suspense stories. One of the bedrooms had a trunk at the end of the bed. It was filled with handmade quilts and thick blankets. Beneath them, I found a bundle of aged letters tied with an old string. I didn't read them right away, but set them aside to go through later. That night, I slept in a sleeping bag on the floor near the stove. The woods outside were pitch black, and the wind screamed through the trees, making the whole house groan and shift. I told myself it was just the wind. Still, I couldn't shake a deep sense of unease. The next morning, I decided to explore the land. My grandmother's property stretched across several acres, most of it heavily wooded. I followed a narrow path down to a frozen stream, my boots crunching through the snow. I saw animal prints here and there and heard the occasional snap of a branch, but never saw any creatures. The woods felt strange, too quiet, like they were listening. Near the stream, I came across an old shack I didn't remember from childhood. It leaned to one side, half collapsed, with a sagging roof. I stepped inside. The floor was littered with debris and old leaves. Smelled damp, like rot. In one corner, I found rusted animal traps stacked in a pile. Nearby was a large wooden box. I forced it open and found a few tools: an axe, a handsaw, and a hammer. They were worn but still usable. I didn't think much of it at the time, but on the way back to the house, I had the oddest feeling, like something had eyes on me. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to catch sight of someone, but the trail stayed empty. That night, the wind picked up again, moaning through the chimney and rattling the windows. I stayed up late going through the letters. Most were from my dad and his brothers and sisters, written when they were teenagers. They were mostly thank you notes for birthday cards and updates on their lives. But one letter was different. It was signed by someone named Thomas, dated 1974. The handwriting was uneven, and the paper was yellowed and fragile. It said, "Asterisk Maggie, I don't know how much longer I can remain here. The woods are different now. I hear noises at night, things that don't belong out there. I tried to tell the others, but no one believes me. Please, if you ever return, be cautious. Don't stay longer than you need to." Asterisk. I read that letter several times. I didn't recognize the name Thomas. What did he mean about the woods being different? I couldn't shake a growing tension in my chest. The following few days passed in a blur. I stayed busy cleaning, stacking firewood, and trying to get the place in order. But every time I stepped outside, that feeling returned. That eerie sensation of being watched. Started out subtle, just a tightness in the air. By the fourth day, it was overwhelming. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. A low, steady banging, like something rhythmically hitting a tree. I froze and listened as the sound moved closer and closer. When it suddenly stopped, the silence felt louder than the noise. I didn't move a muscle. I just waited for daylight. As soon as the sun came up, I went out to look for anything unusual. Down by the stream, I found a tree with long scratches in the bark. Deep ones, like something with claws had torn into it. The snow nearby was disturbed, but there were no footprints. Just a strange circular pattern, like something had been spinning. That evening, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bags and loaded everything into the car. But when I tried to start the engine, it just clicked. I lifted the hood and immediately saw the problem. The battery cables were sliced clean through. Panic hit hard. I pulled out my phone, but there was no reception. The closest town was hours away, and daylight was already fading fast. I went back inside, locked the doors, and pushed a dresser in front of them. I kept the axe from the shed close by. Every light in the cabin was turned on. I thought I heard footsteps on the porch once, but when I peeked out, no one was there. The next morning, I left on foot. I followed the gravel road, hoping to find help or at least a spot with cell service. The trees seemed to crowd in tighter around me. After an hour or so, I noticed a figure standing ahead. A man. He wore torn, outdated clothes and had a hood covering his face. I called out. No answer. I kept walking, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring. My stomach dropped. I spun around and ran back the way I came, my chest burning. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door behind me and collapsed to the floor, still clutching the axe. I don't know how long I waited. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Nothing happened. Eventually, I flagged down a snowplow that passed by on the road. The driver gave me a ride into the next town. I didn't go back after that. A few months later, I sold the property. The buyer didn't ask much, and I didn't offer anything. But sometimes, when it's late and the house is quiet, I remember that man in the woods. I still wonder who he was or what he was, and what might have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. I was out with a small group of friends, hiking along some backcountry trails near Jasper, Alabama. We chose to stray off the marked path and follow some faint animal trails just to see if we could find anything interesting. Roughly an hour into following those tracks, we figured it was time to head back, but we'd made so many zigzags and loops by then that we quickly found ourselves completely turned around. We started making our way in what we guessed was the direction of the main path when we came across a clearing with a falling apart, weather-beaten shack that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Of course, being curious and not exactly thinking things through, we decided to look around. The front door was barely attached and came off the rest of the way when we gave it a push. Some spots in the floor gave way under our steps as we walked through the place. There was a filthy, rotting mattress in one corner, covered in mildew and mostly falling apart, along with random dirty plates scattered around and what looked like a really old, dusty radio setup in one of the smaller rooms. In another part of the shack, we found the fully decomposed remains of what we figured was probably a stray dog or maybe a coyote. After a while of poking around, we figured we'd better try to get back on the main trail before it got too dark so we could set up our tent without scrambling in the dark. We've gone back about 4 or 5 times since that day, taking all kinds of routes and checking every landmark we remember, but we've never been able to find that old shack again. Not even once. Just for the record. One night last January, I wrapped up my final exam for the term. It had been a rough stretch. Sleepless nights, too much caffeine, and the non-stop pressure to keep my grades decent. By the time it all ended, I was wiped out, like I'd been running on fumes. It wasn't just physical tiredness either. It felt like my brain had been scraped clean of any will to keep going. The second I turned in my last assignment, all I wanted was to disappear for a while. There weren't many places I could go. My wallet was nearly empty, and most of my friends were either flying home to their families or broke like I was. My own family wasn't really an option. My parents had recently relocated to South Korea for work, and I'd been left to manage on my own in our small rented place in northern Wisconsin. I needed to get away even just for a couple of days. That's when I remembered the cabin. It belonged to a second cousin of mine, Ethan. He used to let us use it during holidays back when I was younger. The place was tiny, tucked deep in the woods near a frozen lake, around a 3-hour drive north of Green Bay. It wasn't fancy, but it was remote, and that was exactly what I was looking for. I called Ethan, and he said I was welcome to use the place for as long as I needed. He gave me a heads up that the cabin was old and didn't have a lot of modern comforts, but I didn't care. I packed light, some warm layers, a few cans of food, a flashlight, a couple of books, and my laptop. I wasn't planning to do anything more than sleep, read, and maybe walk around in the snow. I left the following morning. The drive was smooth, but as I got further from the city, the more isolated it started to feel. The roads got narrower, the woods grew thicker, and eventually the radio cut out into static. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping low on the horizon. It looked just like I remembered: small, dark wood siding, a sloped roof, and a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. The place was already warm inside, thanks to a local caretaker Ethan had notified. I parked the car and stepped out, feeling the snow crunch beneath my boots. The air hit me like ice, sharp and stinging on my face and fingers. I grabbed my bag and stepped into the cabin. It was simple: a single-room setup with a bed in one corner, a compact kitchenette, a wood stove, and a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet. No internet, no cell signal, and just a few power outlets running off a small generator. There was a neat pile of firewood by the stove, and the scent of burning pine filled the air. It was warm in a way that made me feel oddly safe. That first night was quiet. I heated up some soup on the stove, read a few pages from a novel, and turned in early. I thought the silence would bother me, but it didn't. If anything, the stillness felt like medicine. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't worrying about exams or assignments. I fell asleep fast. The next morning, I decided to explore a bit. The cabin sat close to the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by tall, dense spruce trees. I bundled up in layers, poured some coffee into my thermos, and stepped outside. The snow was deep and undisturbed, except for a few trails left by wildlife. The lake stretched wide, like a sheet of frosted glass, reflecting the dull gray sky. I wandered around for a bit, enjoying the calm. That's when I saw something odd. About 50 yards away near the lake's edge was a hole in the ice. It wasn't big, maybe a foot across, and the edges looked sharp, broken unevenly. It didn't add up. There hadn't been any signs of people nearby, and the ice looked thick enough to walk on. I knelt down for a better look, but the hole was just black water underneath. I couldn't see anything below the surface. It made me uneasy, but I didn't dwell on it and went back inside. The rest of the day passed quietly. I read, napped, and tried to enjoy the peacefulness. But as evening fell and the sun sank behind the trees, I started feeling unsettled. The shadows stretched long and thin across the snow, like reaching arms. What had felt warm and cozy earlier now seemed too small, too exposed. I told myself I was just tired and being paranoid. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin's old wood, every gust of wind shaking the windows made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard movement outside, soft crunches in the snow. I sat up, straining to hear, but nothing else came. I convinced myself it was a deer or something and eventually dozed off. In the morning, I found tracks in the snow. They weren't from an animal. They were boot prints. Someone had walked out of the forest up to the cabin, then turned around and gone back toward the lake. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen anyone since I got there, and the idea that someone had been outside while I slept made my skin prickle. I spent that whole day trying to ignore the fear. I locked the door and double-checked the windows. I kept the fire going, sipped coffee, read more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. That night, the sounds returned. This time, the steps were louder, closer. I froze under the covers, barely breathing, listening as they slowly circled the cabin. They stopped at the door. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, after a long pause, the footsteps slowly moved away, back into the woods. In the morning, there was a second hole in the ice. This one was closer, maybe 20 yards from the front door. The edges looked even more jagged than before, like someone had hacked through the ice with something sharp. I stared at it for a while, feeling the fear tighten in my chest. I decided then and there, I wasn't spending another night. I packed my things, tossed them in the back seat, and climbed into the car. I turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't even try. I kept turning it, praying it would catch, but it was dead. Panic started rising. I pulled out my phone. No bars, of course. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day trying to stay calm. I rationed my food and firewood, telling myself help would come soon. I tried to believe maybe the holes in the lake were just from thawing spots, and maybe I'd imagined the footsteps. But I knew better. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat next to the fire with the biggest kitchen knife I could find in my hand and waited. The sounds returned, but this time they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped right outside the door. I held my breath. Something or someone pressed against the door. The handle jiggled like it was being tested. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes? Hours? Eventually, the pressure stopped, and the footsteps faded into the woods again. By sunrise, there was a third hole in the ice. This one was right in front of the cabin. After that, things are a blur. I must have passed out at some point because the next thing I remember was hearing voices. Real voices. A rescue team had arrived. Ethan had gotten worried when I didn't check in and had sent someone to look for me. I told them what happened. They looked around but didn't find anything. No prints, no signs of anyone else, just the holes in the ice. They said those were likely from natural causes. But I know what I experienced. I know what I heard. Every winter since, I think about those footprints in the snow, circling the cabin, coming closer each night. I used to go to a summer camp in northern Minnesota where for 1 week you'd stay with a group of other kids doing different activities, and the second week was spent on a canoe trip. I had the top bunk in the corner of a wooden cabin that held about 5 bunks, all taken. The camp leader had their own small bed set up behind a curtain on the side. One night, or maybe early morning, sometime between 1 and 3 a.m., I was woken up by a sound. I glanced over at the bunks, and there, standing hunched in the middle of the room, was a shape outlined by the moonlight coming through the window. Couldn't have been taller than 5 feet, had a sharp face, long thin fingers and toes, and reminded me of a goblin. It moved slowly, walking around the cabin and leaning down to sniff each kid who was asleep on the lower bunks. I couldn't move. I was completely stiff with fear. I don't think it realized that there were kids sleeping up top. After a few minutes, it quietly opened the cabin door and stepped outside. I heard it knock over the metal fire barrel sitting just outside the steps. Then I heard the counselor shout something like, "Watch out for the barrel." Too late and oddly timed. That's when I understood that the counselor had still been in bed the whole time. I'm now in my late 30s, and I still think about that night. It really felt like that thing was looking for a child who was awake. I have no clue what it wanted. There were always strange stories at that camp. Kids who had gone missing over the years or rumors about the woods. So I don't really know what to believe. But I do know I never went back. Got any ideas on what that might have been? I'm not someone who doubts the paranormal. I've seen ghosts before, but I've always wondered what exactly that thing was. It was late in October when I got a call from my former husband, Derek. Derek had worked as a sheriff's deputy for nearly 16 years, and although we'd been separated for over 3 years, he still contacted me every now and then, but this time felt different. He asked me to meet him at a remote cabin tucked deep in the woods in the northern edge of Wyoming. He said he'd explain everything once I arrived. I hesitated for a while, unsure, but eventually agreed. Derek had always been a serious man, never one to ask for help unless it really mattered. We hadn't parted on bad terms, and I figured hearing him out wouldn't hurt. Something in his voice that afternoon unsettled me, though. He sounded tense, strained in a way that made me uneasy. I threw some warm clothes and basic items into a duffel bag and hit the road just as the sun was setting behind the trees. The trip took me just under 6 hours, with the last part winding along a narrow gravel path that cut through thick pine forest. My headlights barely lit the road ahead, and the sense of being watched clung to me the entire way. By the time I reached the cabin, it was pushing midnight. The place looked abandoned. The outside was worn, the wooden siding cracked and faded, and all the windows were dark. Derek's old SUV was parked out front, but no lights were on inside. I pulled in beside his vehicle, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the freezing air. The silence around me felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. I knocked on the door, calling his name, but no one answered. Only the sound of wind rustling the trees came back at me. My breath fogged in the chill as I slowly pushed open the door. Inside, it was just as cold as out. The room was sparsely furnished. A worn-out sofa, a wooden table, and a couple of chairs. The air smelled musty, and a fine coat of dust covered nearly every surface. Near the couch, I noticed a duffel bag, his. He had been here recently. I checked every room, my flashlight throwing long, shifting shadows across the walls. The bedroom was empty. The tiny bathroom was just as lifeless. In the small kitchen, I found a few cans of food on the counter, but not much else. Felt like he'd left in a rush. That's when I spotted a stack of papers on the table. Some were folded, others wrinkled and spread out. I took a closer look. They were mostly police files, but mixed in were photographs. Holding my flashlight steady, I sifted through them. The reports detailed a string of disappearances from the past couple of years. All of them had been closed without answers. The photos showed different locations: dense forest, rundown structures, even what looked like a shallow burial site. My stomach knotted. What was Derek doing here? Why bring me into this? I stepped outside to get some air, my breath sharp in the freezing wind. The trees surrounding the cabin felt closer now, like they were pressing in. I called out again for Derek, louder this time. No response, just the wind and the creak of swaying branches. That's when I noticed it. A footprint near the edge of the porch, partly covered by dead leaves. It wasn't mine, and it didn't look like Derek's either. The print was too large. I swept my flashlight across the surrounding area and found more of them. They led off into the forest. Against every instinct I had, I followed. The trail was uneven, scattered with rocks and exposed roots. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods became. Even the wind died off. Every step felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I shouldn't see. About 10 minutes in, I came upon a small clearing. In the middle was a crude campsite, A circle of stones surrounded the remains of a fire long dead. A tarp had been strung between two trees, sagging with damp. Underneath it was a mess. Rope, tape, a blade with a hunting grip. My stomach dropped. Then I saw it. A thin trail of blood leading away from the site. Not a lot, just small droplets. But it was recent. I followed the blood slowly, my flashlight flickering as I moved. Every crunch of the ground felt louder in the silence. It led me to a tall pine with a mound at its base. Branches had been loosely thrown over it, not even buried fully. I cleared them aside and froze. Derek was there, his face pale, body twisted unnaturally. A long gash ran across his throat, and his eyes were wide open, locked in a lifeless stare. I stumbled backward, breath caught in my throat. My flashlight dimmed for a moment, casting me in total darkness. When the beam returned, I scanned the woods. No one, but I still felt watched. I knew I had to get help, but there was no reception here. I'd have to drive back toward the highway. I turned and sprinted back through the trees, my flashlight bobbing with every step. Once back at the cabin, I locked the door behind me and tried to think. Derek was gone, killed, and whoever did it could still be nearby. I searched the cabin for anything that could help. Near the old fireplace, I found a small hatchet, rusted but solid. I gripped it tightly and sat down, forcing myself to stay calm. I must have drifted off at some point. A sound woke me, footsteps outside, slow, measured, crunching on the gravel. I held my breath and clutched the hatchet. The steps stopped just outside the door. Then the knob began to turn. I stood, heart pounding, ready to swing, but the door didn't open. Instead, something slammed against it hard. I backed away. The pounding stopped. Then I heard footsteps moving along the side of the cabin. Glass shattered, the window in the bedroom. They were inside. I didn't stay to see who. I tore open the front door and ran to my car, fumbling to get the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life and I gunned it, gravel flying behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw someone step out of the cabin. Tall, broad shoulders, hooded. They didn't follow, but the sight of them burned into my memory. An hour later, I reached a truck stop with a working payphone. I called the authorities and told them everything. They found Derek's body the next day, but no sign of the man I saw. To this day, the case hasn't been solved. I still don't know why Derek called me there or what exactly he had uncovered. All I do know is that someone didn't want him digging. And that night, I was lucky to make it out alive. Even now, I still see that figure, standing by the cabin, watching as I disappeared into the dark. It was the summer of 2016 when my cousin James, who had recently finished his service as an elite military officer, suggested we take a break and spend a week in a secluded cabin in northern Idaho. James was a tough guy, serious, disciplined, but he also had a calm and steady way about him. I'd always wondered about the things he saw during his time in the military, but he never really opened up about it. Still, this trip wasn't meant for digging into his past. It was about escaping the chaos of everyday life and finding some quiet in the middle of nowhere. The cabin was far from the nearest small town, buried deep within a thick woodland. James had rented it from someone he'd known years ago. He told me it was safe, had all the basics we'd need, and even had a generator for electricity. That was good enough for me. I liked the idea of being disconnected, just nature, clear skies, and no cell service for a while. It took nearly 7 hours to drive there, the last part of the journey being a narrow dirt track that wound through thick trees. The branches leaned in so close overhead, they formed a kind of tunnel. We pulled up to the place in the late afternoon. The cabin was small but built solidly, with thick wooden walls and a stone chimney. A large porch wrapped around the front and overlooked a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. We brought in our stuff, mostly non-perishable food, large jugs of water, and James's gear. He had his usual survival items, including a large hunting knife and a rifle. James was always ready for anything. His years of training showed in how he handled even simple things. I didn't think we'd need any weapons, but he insisted it was always best to have them just in case. The inside of the cabin was just what I had expected, simple and old-fashioned. One main room had a compact kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a sofa near a wood-burning stove. There was a door at the back that led to a small bedroom with 2 sets of bunk beds. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and had everything we needed. That first night, we focused on getting settled. James showed me how to run the generator, made sure the windows and doors were secure, and set up a small fire pit just outside the porch. As the sun dipped below the trees, the sounds of the woods took over. Crickets chirping, an owl hooting somewhere off in the distance, and the occasional rustling of branches in the breeze. When we went to bed that night, I felt oddly uneasy. The place was locked up and we had everything we needed, but something still made me feel a little on edge. Maybe it was just the quiet. Maybe it was just being so far from anyone else. James, however, seemed completely calm. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunching, like someone walking slowly over dry leaves. I stayed perfectly still and listened. The sound came again, a little closer this time. I glanced up at the top bunk. James was awake too, his hand resting on the rifle he'd kept beside him. Neither of us said a word. The steps eventually stopped. Then there was just silence, long and heavy. After a few minutes, James said it was probably just a deer or something like that. I wanted to believe him, so I shut my eyes and tried to fall asleep again. When morning came, James was already outside, scanning the area around the cabin. I went out to join him and we saw faint footprints in the dirt by the porch. They weren't from an animal. They were clearly made by someone walking barefoot or in thin shoes. James didn't seem too worried, said maybe it was just a hiker who'd gotten turned around. Still, he walked the whole perimeter of the clearing, checking everything carefully. Nothing else seemed out of the ordinary, so we went on with our day. We spent the morning hiking the surrounding woods. James showed me how to use a compass and recognize landmarks, skills he said were necessary if we were ever to get lost out there. When we got back later that day, I felt a little more confident about being in such a remote area. But that night, the sounds returned. This time, they were louder, and they didn't stop at the edge of the trees. They came all the way up to the cabin. James and I were both wide awake, sitting quietly in the dark with the rifle between us. The footsteps slowly circled the cabin, one careful step after another. Then they stopped. The silence was worse than the sounds. We sat there, barely breathing, for what felt like forever. Eventually, James said quietly that we should stay where we were and not make any noise. In the morning, we went out and found another set of tracks, this time leading off into the woods on the far side of the clearing. James decided we needed to follow them, at least for a bit, just to see where they led. We hiked for close to an hour, deeper into the forest. Eventually, we came to a small open space. In the middle of it was what looked like a forgotten campsite. There was a collapsed tent, a fire ring filled with rusted metal and ash, and scraps of fabric stuck to one of the trees nearby. It looked like nobody had been there in years, but the footprints ended right there. James didn't say much on the walk back. He was quiet, but I could tell he was tense. That night, things got worse. Right around midnight, we heard the same footsteps again. But now there was something different. A light tapping sound started at one of the windows. James acted fast, turned off the lantern, and motioned for me to stay down. The tapping got louder. Then it stopped. A second later, something slammed hard into the front door, like someone throwing their whole body into it. James picked up the rifle and motioned for me to move. We hurried into the back room and shoved the bunk beds up against the door. The banging continued, now mixed with long pauses of total silence. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped altogether. When we stepped out the next morning, the door was dented but still shut tight. Outside, we saw deep scratches on the wood near the lock, like someone had tried to pry it open with a metal bar or something similar. James said we were done. We needed to go. We packed fast and loaded everything into the truck. Just as we were about to drive off, James froze and pointed toward the edge of the clearing. A man was standing just beyond the tree line. His clothes were filthy and hung off his frame. He had a tangled beard and wild eyes. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there watching us. James didn't hesitate. He started the engine and we drove off without saying a word. We didn't report what happened. James said there wasn't much to tell and nothing we could prove. I never found out who that man was or what he was doing out there. But I know this, he wasn't some lost hiker. He knew we were in that cabin. He wanted something. Every time I think about that week in the woods, I still feel the same chill creep up my back. Out there, miles from anyone, we weren't alone. And whoever was out there with us wasn't just watching. They were waiting. When I was 12, we went to visit my grandparents who had a small cabin way out in the woods near a quiet little lake. The mornings were always beautiful there, with the sunlight hitting the water just right. I brought one of my friends along for the trip since there was no internet, only an old tiny TV from the 80s that hardly worked and a VCR. My grandma had a big collection of scary tapes because she enjoyed horror movies. Now to the real part of the story. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from the nearest city and around 5.5 hours from our house. The drive was fun, and we arrived around 7:45 in the evening. Me and my friend were both excited. I jumped out of the car and ran to hug my grandparents. They led us to the room we'd be staying in. It was upstairs, pretty big, had one bed, its own bathroom, and a small balcony that looked out over the lake. It was winter, and snow was falling by the time we arrived, but I've always liked cool air when I sleep, so I cracked the window open in our room. After that, I went back down to help bring in our stuff. My dad handed us our bags, and my friend carried hers upstairs while I stayed in the kitchen waiting for Grandma to finish making hot cocoa. I asked her if me and my friend could watch a movie before sleeping. She said yes, but reminded us to keep the volume low so it wouldn't wake anyone. Once we finished our drinks, ate a little, and cleaned up, our parents and grandparents had already gone to sleep. Me and my friend looked through the tapes and decided to put on an old horror movie. We went with Camp Killer. It was fun having something to watch before falling asleep. When it ended, we turned everything off and went to bed. I closed the balcony doors before lying down. Next morning, I woke up early, around 8 o'clock, and went downstairs for breakfast. We got ready to take a walk since the sun was out, but the air was still cold. After asking, my grandparents and dad said it was okay, just told us to stay on the marked trail. Grandma even packed us a small bag with a few snacks and cans of soda in case we got hungry. As soon as we finished eating, we started our walk. It was a long, winding trail through the woods, and we went slowly, enjoying the snow. After nearly an hour, I found a large rock and sat down to rest and eat something. My friend sat down next to me. That's when we both heard a loud, strange sound somewhere deeper into the woods, probably a few miles off. We gave each other a look and stood up, heading in the direction of the noise. Not far along, we noticed red stains in the snow. At first, I figured it might have been a fox catching a bird or rabbit. We kept going. Then we heard a voice calling out. It sounded like a girl shouting for help. "Is anyone out there?" We moved toward the voice, but my friend started getting nervous and said maybe we should turn back. I told her it was probably just someone who got lost and needed help. We kept walking, calling out things like, "Hey, where are you?" like kids our age tend to do. We heard the voice again, just as before. So we ran toward it. I ended up tripping on a rock and fell into the snow. My friend laughed, but then she pointed at something up ahead. It was an old cabin sitting by itself. We thought maybe someone was inside and needed help. We went in. Right away we saw shoes, some clothing, and underwear scattered on the floor. There were plates with spoiled food on the counter and cobwebs all over. The place looked like no one had lived in it for a long time. We walked further in and found a back room that looked awful. On the walls were metal chains, and there was a dirty old mattress with straps on the sides. There were stains on the floor and dark spots on the wall that looked like blood. We stood there frozen, then screamed when we turned around and saw a girl standing near the doorway whispering, "Help me." Without thinking, we ran out of the house as fast as we could. We sprinted back to the trail and didn't stop running until we got close to the cabin. Neither of us said a word to my parents or grandparents, scared we'd get in trouble for going too far off the trail. That night, we stayed in our room trying not to think about it. We put on more movies just to keep our minds off it. Later, when we finally went to bed, exhausted from everything, I woke up to a loud scream. My friend was standing near the balcony. I got up and asked her why she screamed like that and told her our parents were going to be mad. She turned to me pale and said it wasn't her. It came from outside. She said the same girl, and now a few more, were standing by the lake yelling for us to help them. We shut the door fast and backed away, completely terrified. Right then, my dad and mom came into our room asking why we were crying. We told them what we saw. My grandma came in too and said there couldn't have been anyone outside, because if there was, she and grandpa would have heard them. They were sitting outside for a while. Me and my friend looked at each other. My friend blurted out that we saw that same girl earlier on our walk. Dad asked where, and we told them everything, the trail, the cabin, what we saw inside. That's when my grandma's face changed. She sat us down and explained something we hadn't expected. Years ago, not too far from there, a man had been caught for kidnapping and hurting girls. He kept them in a hidden cabin in the woods, probably the one we found. He did horrible things to them and then got rid of them. He was eventually arrested and sent away, but the police never found all of the girls. Some were still missing to that day. Sometimes I wonder if they were trying to ask us for help. Maybe their spirits just haven't been able to rest yet. Nobody should have to go through something like that. It was back in 2012 and I was 28. I was working for a small timber operation deep in the hills of Oregon. It wasn't anything glamorous, but the paycheck was steady and I didn't mind the solitude. The woods stretched endlessly in all directions, a dense wall of trees that kept out most of the daylight even at noon. The silence out there wasn't calm. It was weighty, like the forest itself was holding in a breath, listening to every move you made. Most of the shifts were long and exhausting. I spent the days sawing through thick trunks, dragging heavy logs, and trying to keep aging equipment from falling apart. I was used to it by then, even on days when the sky dumped cold rain. But it was the overnight shifts that always unsettled me. That evening, the rain hadn't let up for hours. Not a gentle drizzle either, the kind of downpour that soaks through layers no matter how waterproof your gear claims to be. My boots were filled with cold water, and thick sludge clung to my legs. The wind howled through the trees like something alive, snapping branches and shaking the treetops. By nightfall, the rest of the crew had already left. I had to stay back. Overnight duty was just part of the rotation, and there wasn't an option to say no. The cabin we used wasn't far, maybe a bit over a half-mile from where we'd been working. Just a small, rough shack with a sheet metal roof. Not much, but better than standing out in the storm all night. By the time I got there, the rain had picked up so much it stung my skin. I shoved open the crooked wooden door and stepped inside. It looked exactly like I remembered. Musty, cramped, and barely staying upright. The air smelled like damp wood and old mold, but at least it was dry inside. I hung my soaked jacket on a rusty nail beside the entrance and lit the oil lamp on the table. Its faint orange glow spread across the room just enough to show what was there. A sagging cot with a thin mattress, a small iron stove, an old table, and 2 chairs that didn't match. I tried to light a fire in the stove to warm up and dry off a little, but the wood stacked beside it was damp and useless. Every spark fizzled the moment it hit. After a few tries, I gave up and sat down on the cot, wrapping myself in the scratchy blanket that had probably been there for years. I listened to the storm batter the forest. The trees creaked under the weight of the wind, their groaning mixing with the hammering rain. Couldn't relax. There was something about that storm that didn't sit right. The noise outside seemed off, like everything was happening too close, like the woods were pressing in on the cabin. I tried to sleep, telling myself I was just being jittery. Then I heard something. At first, I thought it was part of the storm. It was quiet, nearly lost in the rain, but it grew clearer. Footsteps, slow, heavy ones, like someone moving carefully through wet earth. My stomach clenched. Nobody was supposed to be out there. The rest of the crew wouldn't be back until sunrise, and this area wasn't the kind of place hikers wandered into. I reached for my flashlight with shaking fingers and switched it on. The beam cut through the gloom and landed on the rain-smeared window. I couldn't see anything clearly, just vague shapes of trees moving with the wind. The footsteps stopped. I stayed frozen, holding my breath. The storm continued to howl, but no other sounds came. Just the constant tapping of rain on the metal roof and the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a deer or even a bear, but the way those footsteps sounded, they had a rhythm to them. Not the kind animals make. Time passed. Could have been a minute or 10. Felt like an hour. Then came the sound. A dull, solid thump against one wall of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it sent a shock through me. I gripped the flashlight tighter and scanned the room, half expecting something to come through the boards. Another thud came, this time from the far side of the cabin. I got to my feet, my legs unsteady. I reached for the hatchet I'd left near the door. The lamp flickered as I moved, and long, shifting shadows danced across the cabin's walls. I crouched beside the window, trying to stay low. The glass was too fogged and streaked with rain to see much, but I thought I caught a glimpse of something. A shape, tall, still, right at the edge of the trees. Then came another thud, louder this time. Whatever it was circling the place. There was no way I could stay inside. That cabin wouldn't hold up if someone or something tried to force their way in. My truck was still parked back at the job site, maybe a third of a mile away. That was my only way out. I threw my coat back on, grabbed the hatchet in one hand, and kept the flashlight steady in the other. As I opened the door, the wind nearly knocked me back. I stepped into the storm, the rain hitting my face like ice. The ground sucked at my boots as I trudged forward, trying to keep my eyes on the woods while not slipping in the mud. The flashlight only lit up a narrow cone in front of me. Everything else was shadows. The footsteps had stopped, but I still felt eyes on me, watching from somewhere just beyond the trees. Then I saw the truck. A flash of lightning lit up the clearing, and that's when I noticed them. 3 figures, barely visible through the rain, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. They weren't moving, just standing there, too still. I couldn't make out their faces through the darkness and the downpour, but I knew they were looking at me. My hands fumbled with the keys. I got the door open and slammed it shut behind me, locking it right away. The engine groaned, but then it kicked on and I didn't waste a second. I threw it into gear and hit the gas. They didn't move as I tore down the trail, mud spraying behind the tires. I checked the rearview mirror once, half expecting to see them chasing me, but they hadn't moved an inch. They just stood there watching. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I never figured out who or what they were. But even now, when it rains like that, I think back to that cabin. I remember how they didn't try to stop me. They didn't need to. It wasn't fear I felt, it was a warning. Like I'd stepped into something I was never meant to find. And that still keeps me up some nights. Did your town ever have stories like the ones about an old shack deep in the trees? Or a stretch of road where strange figures are always seen? My town did. The story about the shack was a tale passed around while we were growing up. Supposedly, just a bit south of the old brick school was a small cabin hidden in the woods that had been left to rot many years ago. The talk was that some really brutal killings had taken place there long ago, and since then, nobody had dared to go back. Of course, if no one's been there in ages, how would anyone know for sure? Still, the story sparked our curiosity, especially when we were young. I couldn't stop thinking about it one summer afternoon while sitting around bored out of my mind with a few friends. There wasn't much happening in the little farming town we lived in. This was before smartphones, and boredom hit hard. The place had maybe 140 people living there, so you can guess we were always looking for something to do. That's when the idea hit us: go find the cabin ourselves. We all got fired up, packed our stuff with whatever we thought might help us track it down. We were hyped, but by the time we were ready, we realized the sun had already gone down. The trip would have to wait until the morning. So the next day, we all met behind the rundown school building and headed off. There looked to be some kind of narrow footpath, probably made for something else way back when, but you could barely see it anymore. It led to a small clearing and then disappeared completely. Wherever that trail had gone, it wasn't helping us anymore. We figured the best shot was to keep heading in a straight line, or at least try to. We didn't want to end up lost. One of my friends, always the cautious type, started drawing arrows on the trees with chalk so we could trace our way back if needed. It was a clever move, though I wasn't sure it would do much good. There were just too many trees out there. We'd been walking for maybe 2.5 hours by then. The rumor said the cabin was only about an hour's walk from town. I started thinking we'd gone too far, maybe missed it completely. When you're around 14 and out in the middle of nowhere with no clear goal, frustration hits fast. That was about where we were mentally, tired, cranky, and doubting this was ever a good idea. That's when one of my friends pointed out something he thought looked like part of an old walkway. It was only slightly covered by weeds and brush. He got excited because a few rocks nearby weren't overgrown at all. We figured it might be worth checking out, so we followed it. After maybe 15 to 20 minutes, we suddenly saw it. We actually found it. An old, worn-down cabin, tucked away like a piece of forgotten history. We were stunned. It didn't seem real. This was the cabin we'd heard about for years, the one tied to those old violent stories. The murder shack in the woods. We all went wild. One of the guys had brought his camera and started snapping pictures right away. We couldn't stop grinning. We'd actually found it. Then came the next step, seeing what was inside. The place was completely boarded up. We circled it fully but couldn't find any way in. Every single window, every door, had thick planks nailed tightly over them. It was a little annoying, to be honest. That's when one of us noticed a tiny window on the side, not boarded completely. Maybe it could be opened. He tugged at it and it creaked open. It wasn't big enough for all of us, barely wide enough for one person. We needed someone small to squeeze through. Our buddy Kyle fit the bill. He was skinny and wiry, the best shot we had. We shined a flashlight through and could just make out a dirt-covered floor inside. We told him we'd pull him back if anything went wrong. He carefully slid through, getting stuck at the shoulders for a second before managing to drop inside. We could see an old staircase inside and hoped like hell it wouldn't give way beneath him. Once he was in, we realized something dumb. The doors and most windows were still sealed from the outside. He couldn't open them from where he was. It was a big flaw in the plan. But not all hope was lost. One of the small kitchen windows was boarded poorly, just barely hanging on. With some teamwork, we managed to pry it enough to bend the nails. We got it open wide enough to crawl through. That's when the place truly gave us the creeps. It looked like time had stopped inside. Dirty plates still sat in the sink, now black with mold. Shoes lay scattered across the floor. Holiday streamers and tinsel still clung to the walls, smothered in a thick coat of dust. It was like someone had left in a hurry and never came back. The downstairs didn't offer much beyond that. What we really wanted to check out was the upper floor. That part felt off-limits somehow, forbidden, but the staircase was a mess. None of us wanted to go up first in case it caved in, so once again Kyle led the way. He went step by step, slow and cautious. The stairs held. One at a time, the rest of us followed. There were only 2 rooms up there. Neither looked like it had been used in a long time. There was no sign of blood or anything violent. Kind of strange, considering the legend said this was where something terrible happened. Maybe the killer had just lived here, no one really knew. We looked around. Old dressers, torn clothes, some dusty boots. While poking around one of the rooms alone, something shiny caught my eye from under a bed. I crouched down and reached for it. It was some weird metal piece, maybe part of an old machine or typewriter. Nothing special. But as I was coming back up, I heard 2 words whispered into my ear. "Go away." It was a woman's voice. No one in our group was a girl. I froze. My whole body went stiff. I looked around, no one was nearby. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was my imagination. I left the object where it was and quietly walked out. Crawled back through the kitchen window. I didn't want to be inside that place anymore. Soon, the others got bored and trickled out one by one. We all silently agreed the place was unsettling. Creepy in a way that didn't need to be explained. As a group, we pushed the loose window board back in place and jammed a small rock into the frame to wedge it shut. Not perfect, but enough to keep it sealed. We figured we'd leave it for the next group of curious kids. As we walked back through the woods, I turned around for one last look at the cabin. And there, just for a second, I swear I saw a face watching me through the upstairs window, the same room I had been in. It looked directly at me and then melted into the wall. I don't know if it was real or not. None of my friends said they saw anything. I never told them. I still don't know what I believe. I don't think it was a ghost, but it wasn't nothing either. It's not something I like to think about, especially not now, years later, as I remember it during my cousin's bachelor weekend. I never really wanted to go from the beginning. Let me rewind about 6 years. My girlfriend at the time had come up with the idea that she really wanted to stay in a cabin out in the woods. Sleeping in a tent was a no-go for her since she hated the idea of just a piece of fabric between us and the outside. But a cabin, a real building with walls and a roof that she could handle. She spent weeks convincing me it would be the perfect nature getaway. Eventually, I gave in and agreed to go. This was supposed to be our great little cabin retreat. Took us a couple of weeks to get it all together. We packed the car and made the 5.5-hour trip to this place she found online. It was a little over 3 hours on the highway, then about 2 more driving slowly through forest roads to get to the spot she'd picked out. To be honest, she had mostly picked the cabin based on the photos. It looked great on the listing, cozy, rustic, private. But when we finally pulled up, it was clear things weren't what we expected. What might have once been a scenic place had definitely gone downhill. You could tell it hadn't been cared for in a while. It just looked old and kind of forgotten. My girlfriend and I were both pretty let down, but we were totally wiped from the long trip, and there was no way we were going to try and get our money back on a 2-night booking. So we decided to just deal with it and head to bed. That's when we found something that really ticked me off. The sheets on the bed looked like they hadn't been washed in ages. It's one thing for a place to be a little rundown, but this was just gross. We checked our phones and of course no signal. So we just pulled off the sheets and slept on the bare mattress. Not exactly a dream night. It wasn't the mattress or the state of the place that kept me up, though. It was the sounds. I wasn't expecting it, but while I was lying there trying to sleep, I kept hearing stuff. It sounded like something or someone was moving around above us. The way the cabin was built, there was an upper crawl space under the roof. But as far as I could tell, it wasn't connected to any rooms. We had brought a flashlight, and since she didn't want to get out of bed and was honestly a little freaked out, I went to look around. I checked all over the inside to see if there was a hatch or opening where something could have gotten in. But in truth, I didn't really want to find anything. I wasn't exactly pumped about running into a raccoon or something worse up there in the dark. After searching a bit, I came up with nothing. So we just decided to try and sleep and ignore whatever forest creatures were doing laps above us. Next morning, we got up and headed out for a hike. One of the things my girlfriend had been so excited about, and I'll admit it was beautiful. Probably one of the best walks I've ever done. Even though we were exhausted from barely sleeping, the fresh air and scenery made up for it. We walked for almost 7 hours. By the time we got back to the cabin, we were beat. We kicked off our shoes and were just being playful, laughing and goofing off, until we noticed something that made our blood run cold. Our food, which we had neatly put away in the tiny kitchen, had been messed with. We didn't bring much, just enough for the trip, and we had stored it carefully. We had locked the door behind us, even though the owner had said it wasn't necessary because the place was so remote. But still, we locked it just to be safe from wild animals. Yet somehow our food had been eaten, and not the way a bear or raccoon might dig through stuff, tearing open packaging and making a mess. No, this was neat. Someone had carefully opened things, almost like they didn't want to leave signs. What really clued us in was the granola bars. We had counted on having them when we got back, but the box had clearly been opened and we were short. There were only 3 left. We'd packed 6. That's when we got scared, because this wasn't a hungry raccoon. This was a person. I suddenly remembered the noises from the night before. My brain started piecing things together. Could someone be living in this cabin or hiding here when we arrived? Maybe they saw a chance to help themselves to our food. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to be there anymore. We started speaking in whispers. Felt like whoever it was could hear us, like there were ears in the walls. I didn't know how far we'd have to drive to get a signal, but I was slowly losing it. After some whispered talks, we agreed we needed to get out, fast. While packing, I realized something else was gone. My wallet. Now I was furious. Not only did someone sneak into our space and eat our food, but they had taken my wallet too. What were they planning to do with it? How would they even get into a town from this far out? It was a 2-hour drive to the nearest gas station. Nothing about this made sense. I had to do something. We figured whoever it was might be staying in that space above the cabin. But how to get up there? We went outside and circled the place. Around the back, near the edge of the roofline, we found it. A small opening. It looked like an attic access hatch held open by a short stick. That was it. More proof someone was living up there. I took a deep breath and worked up the nerve to open the hatch. Flashlight in one hand, I nudged it open, aimed the light inside, and froze. In the corner, crouched in the dark, was a man. He was tiny and skinny, almost like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. He looked up at the light like a rodent caught in a trap. I nearly soiled myself right there, but I kept it together. I yelled at him to toss my wallet down. I told him he could keep whatever cash was inside. I didn't care. Just give me the wallet. He didn't say a word, just lobbed it over without getting up. It landed near me. I picked it up. Felt sticky and gross. We didn't waste another second. We threw everything in the car and tore out of there. Once we got back near civilization and our phones came back to life, we called the cabin's owner. Told him everything. He apologized a ton, said he had no clue anyone had been there, promised to call the cops. We didn't ask for a refund. We didn't want anything from him. We just wanted to forget that we had slept under the same roof as some random guy living in the rafters. To this day, I think about what could have happened if he'd decided to do more than just take our food, or if we hadn't locked the door. But the thing that still gets me the most? How did he get inside if we locked everything up tight? I used to live in a cabin like that just outside of North Carolina, and I've never gone back since. I was 33 when I accepted a job taking care of an old, secluded burial ground. I needed something slower, more peaceful, and far from the constant buzz of city life. This spot, tucked deep in the hills of northern Pennsylvania, seemed like exactly what I had been searching for. The cemetery was small and rarely visited anymore. The job came with a weathered one-room shack that sat on the property, meant for the caretaker to stay in. It had been built sometime in the 1880s, and from the outside it looked like nobody had fixed it up since. I got there in early October of 2022. The air had started to cool, and some of the trees were just beginning to change colors. The area had a quiet beauty to it, solemn, peaceful, and a little eerie. Tall trees bordered the cemetery, their limbs casting long shadows across the moss-covered gravestones. The shack sat just beyond the far edge of the burial ground, right where the woods began. The first thing that hit me about the shack was the smell. The air inside was thick with a wet, moldy odor the moment I opened the door. The wood floors creaked beneath my boots, and the wallpaper on the walls had started to curl and peel away. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had a working wood stove, a mattress, and a small table. It would do fine. The job was straightforward. Look after the graveyard. I kept the grass trimmed, raked up fallen limbs, and made sure the paths stayed clear. It was calm, uneventful work, and at first I appreciated the quiet. Most days went by with nothing much happening. Just birdsong and the occasional sound of movement somewhere in the brush. But after a few weeks, small things started bothering me. The first thing that seemed off was the cemetery itself. A lot of the stones dated back to the 1850s, but a handful were much more recent. The newest one was from 2001. That wasn't too odd by itself, but the entire place felt forgotten. No flowers, no trinkets, no signs that anyone had visited any of the graves in years. Then there was the shack. At night, it felt different. The woods would go still, too still.
No chirping insects, no owls.
Just a deep, strange silence that seemed to press against the windows. I also began hearing faint noises, a scratching on the outside walls, and sometimes what sounded like light steps crossing the porch boards. I told myself it had to be raccoons or something like that, but then one night I woke up to tapping. Not random, but steady, intentional, like someone gently knocking against the outside wall of the shack. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. There was nothing, just the clearing, the rows of gravestones, and a low fog crawling across the grass. The next morning, I noticed footprints in the soft dirt just outside the cabin. They were fresh and too large to be mine. They came in from the woods and stopped right outside the front door. There were no return tracks heading back into the trees. From then on, I kept a fixed blade knife on my belt. I wasn't sure if it was some local messing with me or something worse, but I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Things got worse about a week later. I had just cleared out a few dead branches from one corner of the graveyard when I noticed that one of the graves looked like it had been tampered with. The dirt around it was disturbed, lumpy and uneven, like it had been dug up and filled back in a hurry. It unsettled me, but I chalked it up to erosion from the rain we'd had recently. That night, the sounds returned and were louder. There was heavy breathing outside the shack. I stared through the window and saw a shape moving through the trees. I locked the door and stayed up the whole night gripping my knife. In the morning, I walked back out to the graveyard. The grave I'd noticed the day before looked worse now. Dirt was scattered and the headstone had been shoved over, like someone had been digging there again. That's when I decided to call the owner. His name was Carl. He lived about 2.5 hours south. When I explained what I'd seen, he wasn't too concerned. He said he hadn't been up to the place in years and guessed a wild animal had probably been rooting around. I didn't believe that, but I didn't have much else to go on. That evening, I placed a trail cam, one with motion sensors, on a post facing the cemetery. I wanted to catch whoever was sneaking around. The next morning, I retrieved the footage. First, it was just static, hours of it. But then, sometime around 3 a.m., the screen cleared. A figure appeared, standing silently in the middle of the graveyard. I couldn't make out the face or features. It was tall, unmoving, just standing there. Then the screen fuzzed out again. That was enough. I told myself I'd spend one more night there and then pack up the next morning. I didn't care about the paycheck anymore. I didn't feel safe. That last night was the worst one yet. I bolted the doors and windows and kept a lantern burning. Around midnight, the tapping started again, but this time it was harder, louder. Then came the breathing, much closer than before. I froze, heart pounding, knife in hand. Without warning, there was a crash. Something slammed into the front door hard enough to rattle the frame. I shouted, but nothing answered. Then it hit the door again, and again. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I snatched up my bag and ran out the back door, sprinting into the woods. Branches scratched at my face and arms. I tripped and stumbled, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint shine of my truck headlights. I threw open the door, locked it behind me, and tore down the narrow dirt road, not once looking back. I never returned. A week later, I came across an article online. Some hiker had found a body in the graveyard, not buried, propped up against a tree, wrapped in thick plastic. It had been recent, and the authorities were treating it as suspicious. The report didn't give many details. After that, the place was left to rot again, empty, fading into the woods. I still don't know what I ran from out there. I only know that I was lucky to leave when I did. My mom and 2 older brothers used to visit my aunt and her 3 kids around the Christmas season. The entire family would gather too, uncles, aunts, everyone. They lived up north in a part of the Highlands called Morven Bay in northern Scotland. The exact spot was called Breckner, but people usually just say it's near Elgin, since that's easier to recognize. That area had old stories tied to it, about how witches would gather there on Halloween to do dark rituals, including animal offerings and similar disturbing acts. These were tales from way back, and who knows if they were ever really true. So, our family meetup was held in a holiday cottage we had rented just a short walk away from my cousin's place. It had lots of rooms, which made it great for hosting several people. My older brother, his friend who had moved from Nigeria, and I shared a room. They both fell asleep quickly. I didn't. I snapped awake all of a sudden without knowing why. I looked around the room, eyes still foggy from sleep. It was pitch dark. The only sound was the soft snoring coming from my brother and his friend. Then the bedroom door opened slowly, creaking loudly. I swear I locked up in fear. I didn't see anyone come through, but when I looked more closely, I noticed dark, shifting shapes floating and flickering near the other 2 beds, over my brother and his friend. There were at least 3 of them. One of them stood right beside my bed. This figure didn't really look like a person, just the vague outline of something human. Still, I had a strong sense it was staring right at me. I made the only decision that felt safe. I rolled over to face the wall and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I talked to a few relatives about what happened. Most of them laughed it off and joked that maybe it was the spirits of those old rituals people used to whisper about. None of them took me seriously except one person, my brother's girlfriend. She had stayed in the room next to ours, and she told me something had happened to her too. She said it felt like someone sat down at the end of her bed during the night. She could feel the pressure on her legs, as if a person had leaned their weight against them. But when she looked, no one was there. Her story scared me even more, so I flipped through the guest book, hoping someone else had seen something similar. But there was nothing unusual written in it. I'll never forget what I saw that night. And if you ever find yourself staying in a rental near Morven Bay, especially in that holiday house, keep an eye out for silent shadows creeping into your room after dark. One of the streets from an old battlefield. Most nights when everyone else was asleep, I would hear a woman softly humming. I was the only female in the house at the time, and I slept on the couch. Often, it felt like someone was running straight into the couch with full force. My fears were confirmed one day when I heard voices outside my window. I looked out and saw a local ghost tour group gathered on the porch in front of my house, discussing something. I never caught what they were saying, but it definitely freaked me out. I'm not sure if it's as scary as other people's experiences, but it really left me shaken, making me wonder what in the world had happened in that cabin or on that land. I had just settled into my great-grandfather's cabin, the one he had left me after finishing up a job call. On the second night, I had a vivid dream. In it, I didn't have any of my scars, and I was married to my high school sweetheart. Exactly the life I had dreamed of at that time. In the dream, we owned a pet cat, a bobcat to be exact. The next morning, when I woke up and stepped outside, I saw a bobcat in the forest. But something was off about it. It had a shadow that was twice my height, with 2 arms and a triangular head. The following night, I had another dream. In it, my mother made her famous stuffed peppers with tofu and mushrooms. I ate them while watching the Star Wars movies with the bobcat curled up on my lap. When I woke up that morning, I saw the cat again and yelled at it, telling it that I could see through it. The only thing I didn't despise in the dream was my mother. I had tricked the cat, proving it was trying to deceive me. The next dream was a nightmare, less vivid but still clear. I was attacked repeatedly by family and friends. I never fought back, but I also wouldn't let the bobcat help me. In the next part of the dream, the forest itself came alive, crushing my home and destroying my family. For the first time, the cat spoke. "You will be my echo. It has been decided. I can be a blessing to your life and family, or I can curse all your children. The choice is yours." It waited for a response. We sat across from each other for what felt like forever. And eventually, I woke up to my friend shaking me, frantic, telling me I had been asleep for almost 3 days. My dreams had been a wild mix, swinging from perfect bliss to complete hell, like an upset child throwing a tantrum because the bird in the cage wasn't singing. One day, I was out hunting geese when I spotted a bobcat. It didn't run off, instead following me through the woods. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, having hunted here for years before I moved. But that day, I kept getting lost, with the cat always trailing me. Respect be damned, I thought, and I shot it in the head. It nearly disintegrated, with only a small piece of flesh hanging from its chest. But it didn't flinch, and from that day on, I never had any more strange dreams. Hey, it's Mort here, and thank you so. I never wanted to go in the first place, but let me take you back about 5 years. My wife had this idea that she really wanted to rent a cabin in the woods. Camping was a definite no for me, just a thin sheet of fabric between you and the elements. But a cabin, a solid wooden structure, that was something she could deal with. After weeks of convincing me how amazing it would be, I finally agreed to what was supposed to be a great camping getaway in a log cabin. It took a few weeks to plan, but we finally packed everything into the car and drove 6 hours to this secluded cabin. It was a 4-hour drive, followed by a 2-hour hike through the wilderness to get to this amazing cabin. Honestly, she picked it mostly for the Instagram photos, and when we arrived, we were really disappointed. It wasn't what we had been promised. What had once been a picturesque spot had deteriorated over the years with no maintenance, and it was just a letdown. First, things were okay. We weren't thrilled, but we were exhausted from the long drive. There was no way we'd ask for a refund for a 2-night stay, so we decided to suck it up and get some sleep. That's when we discovered something that really bothered me. The bed sheets looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. The cabin could be run down, but being dirty was another thing. Of course, when we checked our phones, we had no service. So we reluctantly removed the sheets and just slept on the mattress. It was an uncomfortable night, not because of the mattress, but because of the noises. I wasn't expecting anything, but while I tossed and turned, I kept hearing sounds that sounded like animals or something running around above us. The cabin had a space above us, in the roof area, but it didn't seem to connect to any other part of the building. We had brought along a flashlight, and my wife, too scared to look, stayed in bed while I investigated. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of facing a wild animal in the dark, but after searching for a while, I found nothing. So, we decided to just ignore the noises and try to get some rest. The next morning, we woke up, got ready, and went out for one of those amazing hikes my wife had promised me. Well, it was great aside from the lack of sleep, but the hike was incredible, and I would recommend getting out into nature every once in a while. We were completely wiped by the time we got back, having spent about 7 hours walking and enjoying ourselves. We took off our shoes, laughing, joking, and just relaxing when we saw something that instantly changed our mood. Our food had been neatly arranged in the corner of the small kitchen. There wasn't much, so it didn't take up much space. The cabin door was locked, just like the owner had said, though he mentioned we didn't really need to worry about it. We locked it anyway, since it was so isolated, just to be safe from wild animals. But when we walked in, we found that our food had been eaten. Now, wild animals usually make a mess, tearing open food bags, leaving bite marks, and grabbing whatever they can. But this was different. Someone had carefully opened the food packages without being obvious about it. The granola bar box was open, and we were 3 short, meaning only 3 bars were left. We definitely noticed that. That's when we started getting really freaked out. It was clear someone had been here, and then I remembered the strange noises from last night, and everything clicked in my mind. Could it be that there was someone living in the roof, and we just happened to stumble upon their hideout? Had they taken the opportunity to steal our food? My heart dropped, and I suddenly didn't want to be here anymore. My wife and I spoke as quietly as possible, like the place was bugged, like someone was watching us. I wasn't sure how far we'd have to drive to get service, but I was starting to lose it. After a few hushed conversations, we decided it was best to leave. As we started packing up, we noticed something else was missing: my wallet. Now, this was really starting to get to me. Not only had someone taken our food, but now they had my wallet too. How was this person going to get to town? It was a 2-hour drive, and where would they even go? I had to confront them. We had a pretty good idea that they were hiding in the roof, but how could we get up there? My wife and I stepped outside the cabin and circled around, and we found a small hatch on the back of the cabin. It was propped open with a small stick, confirming that someone was up there. I gathered my courage and opened the hatch, flashlight in hand. What I saw in the dark corner terrified me. A small, rat-like man was huddled in the shadows. When the light shone on him, he squeaked, and I won't lie, I almost jumped out of my skin. But I stayed calm and shouted at him to throw my wallet down. I didn't care if there was cash in it. I just wanted the wallet back. To my surprise, he threw it down without hesitation. It felt dirty and gross when I grabbed it, but I didn't care. We quickly shoved everything into the car and sped off. We never went back. When we finally got cell service, we called the owner and told him about the man. He was apologetic and had no idea he was there. He said he'd send the police over to deal with it. We didn't ask for a refund or anything. We just felt completely creeped out knowing there was someone living above us that night. Who knows what he could have done to us if he really wanted to. But the real question that still haunts me is how the hell he got in when we locked the door. That happened during a camping trip when some of his buddies rented a small cabin out near a park in Northern California. They planned to stay there for 3 nights. On the first night, I noticed something strange in the room my cousin and I were sharing. Right after we got into bed, the ceiling began to make loud creaking sounds. It honestly sounded like someone walking above us. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the cold air causing the wood to shift, or maybe some raccoons or other critters on the roof. I didn't think too hard about it and just went to sleep. But by the 3rd night, I couldn't explain it away anymore. It didn't feel like something normal. That night, I turned in earlier than the others. The rest of the guys were still up, laughing, playing cards, and having drinks. Like clockwork, the creaking started again right above my head. I tried to block it out like I had the past 2 nights. But then one of the decorative metal tiles hanging on the wall began to shake and scrape softly against the wood behind it. There was no logical reason I could come up with for that. It didn't seem like it could have been heat-related or from the cold, and no small animal could have made that happen. Still, I was too tired to care anymore, so I just rolled over and did my best to pretend I didn't hear it. That's when something wrapped its hand around my forearm. I didn't panic. I just whispered, "Nope," not wanting to mess with whatever energy was in that cabin. A few seconds later, I clearly heard the same creaking sound again, but this time it was coming from the ceiling of the room down the hall. I was somewhere between 8 and 9 years old when that happened. He got married for the first time when he was in his early 40s. For their honeymoon, he, his new wife, and her daughter, who has special needs and is honestly one of the sweetest kids you'd ever meet, decided to spend a few days at a cabin up in the Sierra Crest area of northern Nevada. They rented the cabin, brought in their bags, and settled in for what was supposed to be a peaceful 3-day getaway. Everything went normally until the final night. That night, my uncle stayed up late watching television in the front room. His wife and stepdaughter had already turned in for the night. At some point, he needed to use the bathroom, so he got up, walked over, did what he needed to do, and stepped back out. The only source of light in the whole place was the television screen glowing from the living room, but it was bright enough to cast a glow through most of the room and down part of the hallway. As he opened the bathroom door, he saw what he thought was his wife quietly heading down the hallway toward the kitchen. He assumed she'd woken up feeling hungry or maybe just wanted some water. He figured he'd say something to her, so he followed her down the hallway. Just as she reached the far end, she turned a bit toward the kitchen like she was about to walk in, but then bolted straight into the kitchen at a speed that didn't look natural. It was like she'd been yanked forward. The figure was wearing a white flowing nightdress that looked a lot like the one his wife had gone to bed in. Her hair fell just past her shoulders, which also matched his wife's. Totally spooked, he took a few steps back and walked quietly to the bedroom to double-check. He peeked inside and saw both his wife and stepdaughter sound asleep in bed, exactly where they'd been earlier. He didn't sleep at all after that. First thing in the morning, they packed up and left. Later, he contacted the person who had rented out the cabin to him. He said something like, "You never mentioned that your place had a ghost." The owner didn't miss a beat and replied, "Oh, you saw her, huh? Here's the thing. My uncle never said he saw a woman." That response was all the confirmation he needed. The guy clearly knew about the figure in the house. Afterward, my uncle told me that if that thing had turned around and looked at him, He probably would have completely lost it then and there, like physically. He said it still rattles him just thinking about it. This isn't my personal story. It actually happened to a buddy of mine's uncle, but he swears it's true. One weekend about 8 years ago, my wife Lisa and our 3 little boys, who were all under 10 at the time, were staying up at our cabin in the northern part of Michigan. We'd bought the place just over half a year before this happened. From the very start, we noticed odd things. Shapes moving, flickering lights, and things shifting in the corners of our vision. Everyone went to sleep around 10:30 that night. I stayed up and headed into the kitchen to grab a piece of the chocolate chip bars my wife had baked earlier in the day. While I was slicing off a square, I clearly heard a soft female voice whisper, asterisk, "Hey, what are you doing in here?" Asterisk, it made my heart jump. I spoke out loud, saying, "Lisa?" without looking around. When I turned my head, the room was empty. I shrugged it off and went back to cutting the cookie bar. Just a few seconds later, the same voice came again, this time louder and clearer, whispering, asterisk, "Hey, are you gonna eat that? I want one too." Asterisk, I spun around quickly and scanned the kitchen, but no one was there. I didn't even bother to finish my snack. I darted straight into the bedroom and dove under the covers. Lisa was still awake and lying in bed, clearly not the one who had spoken in the kitchen. After laying there for a while and calming down, I forced myself to go back to the kitchen and clean up the mess I'd left. I didn't hear anything else that night. The following evening, everything was quiet again until I got into bed. I had just rolled onto my side when I felt a light tug on the sleeve of my shirt. I turned to see what it was and heard a quiet whisper say, asterisk, "Mom? Dad?" Asterisk, I immediately walked across the hallway to the boys' room, thinking maybe one of them had gotten up, but they were all sound asleep. While standing there, I caught a few more whispers, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like someone was murmuring just out of earshot. That night, I left a small recorder running on the counter in the kitchen, thinking I might catch something on tape. I haven't actually listened back to it yet. Sometimes I wonder if there's a small chance that someone was playing tricks and whispering through the heating ducts. But our cabin sits off a lonely gravel road, far from any busy areas. The nearest homes are other cabins, most of which sit empty most of the year. If someone was trying to prank us, they'd have had to go out of their way and risk getting caught just to mess with strangers. Just to add to the strange atmosphere, my old friend Sean once told me a creepy story from when he was a teenager. He had been spending the night at his family's cabin somewhere in the Oregon woods. In the middle of the night, he woke up to the sound of someone murmuring. He opened his eyes and saw a pale, wild-looking woman just inches from his face, whispering through the thin wooden slats of the cabin's fence. She was clearly under the influence of something, drugs or alcohol, but in the moment it didn't matter. To a kid, that kind of thing is horrifying no matter the cause. I still think about all of this from time to time. This story originally came from my uncle. Came along with me to camp. We were placed in the same cabin. We stayed up pretty late, just talking and messing around until we got tired and finally knocked out. My buddy Brian and I had swiped some instant coffee packets from the cafeteria, and we mixed them into cold water that night. Brian didn't handle caffeine well like I could, so he ended up staying up a bit after the rest of us had passed out. I asked him what he was still doing awake, and he told me he had brought a book and was going to read it until he got sleepy. It was around 1 a.m., and everything was quiet. We were all resting easy when the loudest scream ripped through the cabin. Brian was curled up in his sleeping bag, crying and trembling like crazy. Everyone else in the cabin ran over to check on him and find out what happened. He had screamed so loudly, and if that didn't wake up the other cabins and counselors, the loud sobbing that followed definitely did. Once the staff were in our cabin, I had to stay up on my top bunk so I wouldn't get crushed in the chaos. Brian started telling everyone that he'd seen a ghost walking through our cabin. He also mentioned that he heard a soft wind blowing as the figure moved. One of the other guys in our cabin looked over at him and said he heard the same breeze. They sent Brian home the next day, but the rest of us stayed. Still, something felt off after that. When we got back home, I talked to Brian more about what happened. He gave me extra details. What made it all so strange was that Brian was always a straight-up, no-nonsense kind of guy. Honest to a fault. He looked really shaken by what he saw, and I could tell he wasn't faking anything. At first, I wondered if maybe the caffeine had messed with his head. But then I remembered we had coffee the night before too, and nothing weird happened. Brian also drank coffee pretty often. He liked the taste even if it made him stay up longer than usual. He told me that when he first saw the figure, it was only for a few seconds, maybe 3, but he froze, totally stunned. The ghost didn't look like the ones you see in horror movies. It was faint, almost like it wasn't fully there. The weirdest part? It looked like a young kid. It wasn't wearing anything from our camp or school, but clothes that looked really, really old. Brian said he wasn't exactly scared during those 3 seconds. More like frozen in place because he realized he was seeing something that shouldn't exist. But then, after those few seconds, he screamed. That's when the ghost kid turned toward him. Its eyes were empty, completely lifeless, and then it dashed out of the cabin. That's the wind sound that Brian and the other guy had heard. There's something Brian said that I still remember clearly. If I had been in his shoes, I would have questioned everything. But he told me that when the ghost boy looked at him, even for just a moment, it felt like time stopped. He said it didn't feel like his brain was imagining anything. The kid's eyes had no feeling in them, no emotion, no soul, like everything had been sucked right out. That image haunted me. I felt terrible for him. Those were the things he told me after the trip. I honestly don't think he'll ever go camping again. All of this began over the course of 3 years, starting in 2011, when I moved into a cabin. A childhood friend of mine asked if I'd consider being her roommate, and since I needed to leave my parents' house and she needed help with rent, it seemed like the right choice. The cabin was built in the 1700s, although we couldn't confirm the exact year. The road it sat on was named after the original family who owned the land, a tobacco farming family who once controlled a large area now part of one of the largest cities in the country. If you search for an American colonial cabin, you'll find buildings similar to this one. We initially thought it might have been used as slave quarters, but we later figured it was probably a stable house. The stable theory seemed plausible when our dog dug up an old horseshoe one day, which I still have. On the night we moved in, I immediately sensed something was off. The house had odd quirks. There were no doors leading to the upstairs room, where my bedroom was, or to the downstairs room, where my roommates slept. The downstairs bedroom had been added in the 80s, and the previous owners had also built a much-needed kitchen and bathroom, as the original cabin lacked both. Now that you have an idea of the place, let me tell you what happened next. Right after we moved in, I had this constant feeling of being watched. The house always felt cold, dark, and damp, like being in a cellar. Of course, it's normal for an old cabin to feel that way, but there was something else. It started with scratching sounds. Every night, I'd wake up to scratching noises coming from right underneath my bed, near my head. At first, I thought it was just mice, but after listening more closely, I realized it wasn't. The scratching was more deliberate, like something was dragging across the floor in long, slow strokes. I would cover my head, block out the sound, and close my eyes. I was 24 years old at the time, but I felt like a child again, too scared to face whatever it was. I didn't want to deal with any strange spirits. One night, I was awake when the scratching started. Came from the far side of the room, above my bed. The The sound moved down the wall and directly beneath me. After a while, it crossed the room, went back to the wall, and then the noise stopped. That's when I realized it wasn't mice. The walls of the cabin were solid wood. The logs inside were the same as the ones on the outside, and there was no space between the floor and ceiling. The place was solidly built. I started getting frightened and decided to sleep downstairs. My roommate asked me what was going on, and I told her about the scratching. She admitted she'd been hearing the same thing when she was home alone. This all happened in the first week. Here's the part that's really strange. When we moved in, I had to unscrew all the screws the previous tenant had put into the windows, and one of the exterior doors had been screwed shut. We also found strange, leftover rabbit food in the oven. Well, at least that's what we thought it was. There was also a stack of mail order catalogs the previous tenant had been receiving. We joked about how the guy must have been some kind of shut-in Satanist, but looking back, I'm not so sure we were joking anymore. We started sleeping in the living room together. The atmosphere felt a little less unsettling when we were in the same room. But then one night, I had a strange dream. I dreamt that a dark force was approaching me. In the dream, I was watching myself sleep from a third-person perspective. This force loomed over me, and I felt a terrible pressure building in my head, along with a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The sensation grew so intense that I suddenly woke up. Just as I did, the TV turned off on its own, as if someone had used the remote. We'd been having problems with the TV turning on and off, but this felt too coincidental to ignore. I remember clearly going to bed with the TV off, so how could it have turned on? After that night, we started sleeping in my roommate's room. She said she'd never experienced anything in there. Maybe because it was an addition to the cabin. I'm not sure. Either way, our ghost seemed to have a funny way of pushing us together. Now we're married and trying for a child. We've been married for 6 years. One day, while reading upstairs, I was nearly falling asleep when the window in my room started opening and closing on its own. I'd had enough of this ghost, so the next day I set up the exact same situation again, and sure enough, the windows opened and closed on their own. It was strange that it only ever happened when I was present. So, I yelled at whatever it was, telling it to leave us alone and that I was tired of its nonsense. It seemed to work for a while. But then, when I was home alone, the alarm clocks would go off as soon as my wife left. Drawers would open on their own, and there would be banging on the front door. Over time, though, the activity seemed to die down. I think as I grew older, the spirit stopped bothering me as much. Now, my in-laws live in that same cabin. They were my landlords at the time, and the place now feels warm, cozy, and homely. I can spend time there alone now without feeling any negative energy. The cabin is still part of the family, and my mother-in-law refuses to let go of it. I went from being a young 20-something who didn't care about house repairs to cleaning gutters and scheduling repairs for the old place. I've grown fond of that cabin and everything it's brought me. When my father-in-law passed away, I spent some time there alone, hoping for a familiar knock on the door, but nothing came. Now, when I visit, there's no feeling of dread, just warmth, comfort, and safety. It feels like the spirit wasn't trying to haunt us forever. Perhaps it was more like a spiritual guide, watching over us until my wife and I grew older, and then it left. The ghost seemed to always mess with me more than my wife. Maybe I had an open connection to whatever was there that allowed it to come through more easily. Both of us experienced strange occurrences, but I've always been more attuned to the paranormal than she is. My mother swears she's seen a ghost before, and I think my side of the family is more sensitive to these things. We never talked much about it, but over time, stories started to come out, most of them good ones. It's just something that seems to run in the family. This is an experience I had with my best friend from high school, back in 2006 in a small town in upstate New York. We met in 3rd grade and have remained close ever since. We're both in our late 20s now. Let me give you some context. My friend, Mia, and I hit it off immediately when we first met, and we were inseparable. We spent so much time at each other's homes that Mia's mom, Janet, turned their guest room into a room for me, complete with clothes, toys, and pictures. I had everything I needed there. I even had photos of Mia and me displayed on the walls of their house. Janet always wanted 2 daughters, and she loved me so much that she often referred to me as her second daughter. Now, on to the main story. This happened when Mia and I were in 10th grade. Janet, who had been divorced for a few years, had been dating men she met on dating sites like eHarmony. She was excited about one man she had been talking to for a few weeks. She would always show us their profiles and tell us how charming he was before she went on actual dates. Janet always said, "I need my daughter's approval," before going out with any guy. One evening, she called us into her room to show us the man she had been speaking to. His profile was typical for a middle-aged man in 2006, with a headline that read, "Looking for a strong woman." I made a joke about the strange use of capitalization and the odd way he started his profile, but we kept reading. The profile mentioned his background in metalwork, his love for steel, and his work in a foundry, which apparently kept his icy heart warm enough. He was described as handsome with well-groomed black hair, a beard, a strong jaw, and piercing blue eyes. I told her that while he was good-looking, something about it felt off. Mia joked that Janet always seemed to pick the antisocial ones, and we both laughed, knowing she wasn't wrong. Janet had brought home some odd characters before. We told her to go ahead and meet him, so they made plans for dinner. He was driving 2 hours to meet her, and we helped Janet pick out an outfit, style her hair, and do her makeup before she left. Once she went upstairs to relax before the date, Mia and I stayed behind in her room, painting a wall and listening to music. Out of nowhere, a man walked into the house without knocking, ringing the doorbell or anything. The dogs didn't bark, and we didn't hear him arrive. We were so startled that we jumped and screamed. He had appeared out of thin air and was standing behind us. He spoke with a low, gravelly voice, saying, Well, I didn't know I was getting a 2-for-1 deal." We stood there in shock as he casually walked into the room, the smell of cigarettes filling the air. As he got closer, I realized he looked like the man in the photo, but his hair was graying instead of black, and his eyes weren't icy blue. They were black, completely dark with no visible whites. It was like he had no pupils at all. Before I could process it, Janet shouted from upstairs, asking if we were okay. She probably thought we were messing around. She came down and was visibly shocked when she saw the man standing in front of us. He turned toward her and said in a much softer tone, "Janet, you look beautiful." I knocked, but no one answered, so I let myself in. "These are your girls. They're beautiful, just like you." I'll never forget how he said "you" in that way. It made us both feel uncomfortable. Mia and I exchanged uneasy looks, and Janet glanced at us before returning her attention to him. We could both feel the strange tension in the room. Janet gave a strained smile and said, "Next time, just ring the doorbell and I'll answer the door." He nodded and moved toward her, wrapping her in a hug like they were old friends. Janet shot us an eye roll while they embraced. As they walked down the stairs, Mia and I immediately texted her, telling her about how weird the guy seemed. About 10 minutes later, Janet came back upstairs to check on us, apologizing for the situation. She reassured us that the man didn't mean to make us uncomfortable and said he had just gotten carried away. She told us they were about to leave for dinner, so we wished her a safe trip and headed back upstairs. Mia and I looked at each other. We both knew something wasn't right, but we couldn't shake the eerie feeling we had just gotten from the man. About 15 minutes later, we heard them leave. Janet called out that she loved us as they headed out the door, and we called back, saying we loved her too. As soon as the door closed, we started talking about how strange the whole situation was. Mia was the first to speak over me, saying, "Did you see his eyes? What was up with that?" We both agreed that something was definitely off. Mia and I texted Janet again, telling her how we felt about the man. She responded, saying things were going well, and she would check in with us every hour to let us know she was safe. But we couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Janet seemed to be under some strange spell, and we started to feel even more uneasy. She texted us every hour, and the last message she sent said, "I'm okay, but I'm freaked out. I'm heading home now. Be there soon." We waited anxiously, and about an hour later, we saw headlights pulling into the driveway. We turned off the lights and peeked through the window, trying not to be seen. A truck sped into the driveway, and the passenger door opened before the truck even came to a full stop. Janet jumped out of the truck quickly, looking around nervously, and waved at the driver. She jogged toward the front door, clearly anxious, and waved the truck off. She unlocked the door and slipped inside without a word. "Let's keep the lights off and go upstairs," she said, locking the door behind her. We followed her up to Mia's room, where we could see the truck still parked in front, its lights on and the engine running. Janet finally began telling us what had happened. She explained that the man had suggested they go to a park for a picnic instead of the restaurant he had originally planned, but she wasn't comfortable with that. He insisted, and she reluctantly agreed. She said he kept talking about how easy it was to get her alone and how he liked strong women because they had fight. She started feeling more uncomfortable, and when he suggested they go to his vacation home nearby, she agreed to go because she felt bad about him driving so far. When they arrived, the house seemed nice enough, just a log cabin near a small town, about 30 minutes away. But as the night went on, Janet started realizing that this man wasn't who she thought he was. He kept making strange comments about her, and she started feeling more and more uneasy. Eventually, Janet asked him to take her home, claiming she wasn't feeling well. He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed. Once in the truck, though, he started asking her about Mia and me, questions that made her skin crawl. He asked her what we had done wrong in the past, what we got punished for, and even asked, "Would you sacrifice yourself for one of your girls?" That question sent chills down Janet's spine. As they were heading home, Janet noticed strange items in the back of the truck. Chains, a duffel bag, and a large metal object that made her even more uneasy. When she got home, she immediately called the sheriff and told him what happened. The sheriff, who knew Janet personally, quickly arrived at the house just as the man was getting out of his truck. The man panicked and tried to back into the sheriff's vehicle, but he was blocked and had to drive through the yard to escape. The sheriff pursued him, and the man quickly left the scene. Janet, Mia, and I were shaken up, but the sheriff reassured us that everything would be okay. The man was never heard from again, though we did get some eerie messages on Facebook. The last message we received from him was about 3 months later, and since then, there's been no sign of him. Even though it's been a long time, we still feel relieved that we never saw that man again. I've always had a deep affection for the forest. There's something unique about how it can make you experience so many emotions at once. The endless rows of trees, all appearing alike as they stretch far ahead, each one different from the others in its own way. The dense canopy overhead, which somehow blocks the sunlight and creates a hidden, secluded space where only you seem to exist. When I was younger, those forests were where we lived. They were where we spent all of our free time. It didn't matter how far we went as long as we made it home in time for dinner. The rest of the day belonged to us. I can say without a doubt that those moments are some of the best memories I carry with me. But one day, one memory stands out more than the rest, even after all these years. The woods around where we lived were so familiar that I couldn't imagine there was a single part of it we hadn't explored. We probably covered miles of the land surrounding our houses, but as kids, We didn't really concern ourselves with how much land there actually was. You didn't think about things like that when you were young. You just set out with your friends and let the day lead you wherever it wanted. We did have landmarks, though. We knew the giant stump of a fallen tree meant we were only 5 minutes away from home. The clearing meant we were 10 minutes away, and the rundown shack that had been there for ages told us we were 20 minutes out. None of us ever wrote any of this down or even talked about it. It was just something we all learned through years of exploring. So one day, a group of us ventured deep into the woods. There was no set plan or goal, we just wandered. We passed all the usual landmarks, laughing and joking as we went, not really rushing but also not slowing down. The trees around us kept changing, but nothing felt different until we stumbled upon a clearing. All of us stopped in our tracks. The laughter, the chatter, everything just fell silent. There was something about this place that felt wrong. For one, none of us recognized it. The trees that had been all around us seemed to vanish all at once, revealing an empty space. The thing that caught our attention was a small cabin in the center of the clearing. It looked like something we'd seen before, but this one was different. It had clearly been damaged, possibly by fire. It looked as if it had nearly burned to the ground. I can still remember how it almost seemed like I could smell the smoke in the air, like it had just happened. We moved closer in silence, the air thick with unease. The door, or what was left of it, hung limply from one hinge, and the porch groaned beneath our feet as we approached. I had this overwhelming sense that we should turn around and run, but no one did. We all hesitated at the broken door. I gave it a push with my foot, and it crumbled inward with a loud snap, almost as if it was made of paper. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. But there was no response, just the heavy smell of burnt wood. Inside, everything was blackened. Bookshelves, a fireplace, even a rocking chair with the back destroyed. And then we heard it, a thud. We all turned, scanning the room, but nothing was there. Another thud, this time louder. We looked at each other, and no one was laughing. Then it happened again, a third thud, and that's when we saw it. A trapdoor in the floor, perfectly square, with a rusted padlock on one side and worn hinges on the other. The door began to move, just slightly, with dust and ash drifting up as it shifted. The lock creaked as it stretched, then another thud came, this time harder. We were frozen, our eyes glued to the trapdoor, and it wasn't just shifting now. It was bending. Something beneath it was trying to get out. For a brief moment, I saw it. A single crazed eye staring up through the gap. I don't remember running, but I suddenly found myself sprinting, my feet pounding the dirt. I could hear my friends ahead of me, their footsteps matching mine, but there was something else, something following us. Despite never being the fastest in the group, the sound of whatever was behind us pushed me to go faster. I passed them all. Finally, when we reached the old redwood stump, we stopped. We all bent over, hands on our knees, struggling to catch our breath. None of us said a word. No one wanted to admit how scared we were, but we all knew that something was wrong. We looked at each other, and without a word, we turned and made our way home. That evening, there were no jokes, no comments. Nothing about the incident was ever spoken of again. The next day, we went back out to play, but we had an unspoken agreement. We never went that deep into the woods again. We didn't need to say it, but we all knew. Even now, as an adult, I can't explain what happened. Sometimes, I think about it and wonder what was trying to escape from beneath that trapdoor, and how close it came to breaking free. That thought still sends a chill down my spine. One afternoon, I had just returned home from the gym, eaten, and was about to relax when my friend called. He asked if I wanted to go for a ride on my motorcycle. This was something we often did, just cruising around, playing music, enjoying the ride, and soaking in the good vibes. The weather was perfect, hot, sunny, and clear. So, I grabbed my helmet and keys and headed out. At first, we just cruised around, blasting music and soaking up the sun. But eventually, I started running low on fuel, so we decided to head back. That's when my friend suddenly pointed out a gravel path that led into the forest. There didn't seem to be much else to do, so we thought, why not check it out? The trail was steeper than it appeared at first, so much so that my friend had to jump off while I powered my bike up the incline. Once we reached level ground, I decided to ride ahead a bit to see where the trail led. It was mostly a winding gravel path weaving through thick trees. Then, on the left, I noticed something odd. An opening in the woods with fresh tire tracks leading down another trail. Stood out, but I didn't think much of it and kept going. That's when I saw him. About 10 feet ahead, partially obscured by the curve of the road, a man stood next to a car. He hadn't seen me yet, but I had a clear view of him. He looked to be in his 30s, wearing a black cap and a gray zip-up hoodie. Something about him didn't sit right with me. My first thought was that we had wandered onto private property, but there were no signs or fences to indicate that. Still, something in my gut told me we should turn around. I rode back to my friend, who was catching his breath after walking up the steep incline with his heavy helmet. I told him about the guy, and just as we were debating whether to check out the side trail with the tire tracks, we saw something that made our stomachs drop. Headlights. Car was coming fast. My friend practically jumped onto the back of the motorcycle, and we took off down the hill. As we hit the main road, I glanced in my mirror, and the car was still behind us. It had turned onto the road, following us, matching our speed, and closing in. I could feel my pulse racing. I took a sharp turn down a smaller road I had used before, one that led to a bike path. When we looked back, the car had stopped, just sitting there watching us. After what felt like an eternity, it slowly drove away. We sat in the silence for a moment and laughed it off, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe we had overreacted. Then we looked up the road on Google Earth. At first, it seemed normal enough until we found some houses. Old satellite images showed multiple homes along the path, but one in particular stood out. It looked well maintained, with neatly mowed grass and a caravan parked outside. But something was off. There was trash everywhere, clothes scattered along the gravel path, and debris strewn across the yard. It looked abandoned yet recently used. Then came the real shock. When I tried to follow the road further on Google Earth, the path abruptly blurred out. The end of the road was completely obscured, like it had been intentionally erased. Couldn't let it go, so we decided to go back. We hadn't planned on going so soon, but curiosity got the better of us. This time, we brought another friend and drove instead of using the motorcycle, and I wish we hadn't. The road felt different. Paths that should have been familiar now seemed off. But the biggest shock came when we saw it. A cabin. It hadn't been there before. I was absolutely certain of that. We had looked at that exact spot last time, and there had been nothing but trees. But this cabin was old and weathered, like it had been there for decades, though still maintained. Then we found a roadblock, a fresh one. Someone had put up a barrier, blocking the final stretch of the trail. We had to leave the car behind and walk the rest of the way. The closer we got to the end of the trail, the worse the feeling got. I kept glancing over my shoulder, the sense of being watched growing stronger. Finally, we saw it. A nondescript building surrounded by a massive fence. Next to it, a camouflage radar mast loomed over the treetops. Then we saw the sign, a Defense Department warning, stating that taking photos was illegal. I wasn't about to mess with that. We turned around and made our way back to the roadblock. Before we left, we decided to check out the mysterious cabin. My friend went up to the window, and I stayed back, an awful feeling coiling in my gut. He only looked inside for a second before his body went rigid. Then he ran. I didn't ask questions. I just ran after him, and we jumped into the car. As I sped away, I finally got him to speak. The inside was staged, he said. Too perfect, too clean. It looked fake. Then he told me the creepiest part. There had been a steaming cup of coffee sitting on the table inside. Someone had just been there, and they were watching us. I've been analyzing the Google Earth images, and something's seriously wrong. One of the houses, the one with the caravan and the well-kept lawn, is gone. The other two houses are still there, but that one's been wiped off the map, as if it never existed. But I know I saw it, and it wasn't abandoned. I don't know what's going on out there, but something's not right. When I was 7 years old, my dad, Arthur, took me and my older brother, Thomas, to a secluded cabin deep in the countryside for a week-long holiday. We brought our tabby cat, Whiskers, along with us. The cabin was charming but isolated, surrounded by dense woods and far away from any nearby village. The bedrooms were on the second floor, and mine was the farthest from the others, right where the forest began. A single window sat beside my bed, giving me an unsettling view of an old oak tree that I had tried and failed to climb the day before. There were no curtains or anything to block the outside world. One night, I was feeling homesick and couldn't sleep. Whiskers lay curled up beside me as I read a comic book by flashlight. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard a soft tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind, but then the tapping became more distinct, like someone knocking on the glass. Then, a voice whispered, "Open up, lad. It's me, Daddy." A cold chill gripped my heart. I knew it wasn't my father. I wanted to scream, but fear froze me in place. The voice continued, "Let me in, Deo. It's freezing out here. Come on, son. I just want to cuddle." I turned away from the window, clutching Whiskers. The cat's fur stiffened under my hands, and he hissed at the window. I buried my face in his fur, hoping the stranger would just leave. But then came a sound that still haunts me to this day, a screeching noise that sent chills down my spine. I slowly turned my head to see what it was. The figure outside was grinning, its mouth unnaturally wide, and its eyes gleamed with malice as it dragged a knife across the glass, creating that dreadful sound. I finally found my voice and screamed. The man's grin twisted into a snarl of anger and surprise. His eyes locked with mine for a moment before quickly shifting to the door. Just then, my father burst into the room, holding his old hunting rifle, with Thomas close behind, wielding a cricket bat. The man outside, now pale with fear, staggered backward, and I heard the thud of his feet hitting the ground below. My father rushed to the window just in time to see the shadowy figure vanish into the woods. We didn't sleep that night. My father stayed by the window with the rifle in hand, while Thomas sat beside me on the bed. The police arrived the next morning, documenting the scratches on the glass and the footprints in the snow beneath my window. They said they would patrol the area, but we left the cabin that day and never went back. The man was never found. To this day, I can still remember his voice, soft yet coaxing, like a snake trying to lure its prey. I still hear the footsteps in the snow and his voice calling after me. Whiskers, now 14 and as feisty as ever, remains my hero. He never stopped hissing until that stranger was gone. And I've never stopped double-checking that my windows are locked. One night, I stayed on the edge of a national park in an old, worn-down cabin. To call it secluded would be an understatement. The only access road was a 4-mile stretch of dirt and gravel that twisted through a thick forest, barely wide enough for a single car. The trees were so dense on either side that, in some places, it felt like I was driving through a tunnel of tangled branches. There were no streetlights, no nearby neighbors, and no phone signal. Just me, the trees, and whatever else called the wilderness home. The cabin itself was basic, no electricity, and, most importantly, no way to lock the door. The owner was against any modern updates to their beloved off-grid retreat. First, I didn't think much of it. I grew up in the country, so I figured I could handle being without modern comforts. My roommate, however, was a city guy working for the park service, and he didn't mind the lack of a locking door. He joked, "What, are the squirrels gonna break in?" I didn't laugh. At first, the disturbances were minor, just some noises at night. I figured it was probably just wildlife. The place was deep in the forest, after all. But the sounds weren't random, like the rustling of wind through trees or scurrying of small animals. No, these were slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy and crunching through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a deer or a wild pig or some other harmless creature. But as the nights went on, the pattern became too obvious to ignore. The footsteps would start from a distance, moving slowly through the trees. Never running, never rushing, just a steady walk. Then they would stop, always in the densest part of the underbrush, where I couldn't see a thing beyond the thick foliage. I'd hold my breath, straining to listen. Sometimes there'd be complete silence, while other times, I swear I could hear something breathing. Not the quick, shallow breaths of a deer or the huff of a wild boar, but something deeper, something heavier. Minutes would drag by, sometimes an hour, before the footsteps started again. Only this time they were closer. A cold sense of unease crawled under my skin. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling that came with it. The prickling sensation at the back of your neck, the gut-deep instinct that something was watching. It followed me everywhere, even during the day. The vast, open property that once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretched farther, and every time I stepped outside, I felt like eyes were on me. The fact that the cabin's door didn't lock became a constant thought in my mind. Each night, as the sounds continued, my mind spiraled with what-ifs. What if it wasn't just an animal? What if it wasn't just my imagination? What if one night, whatever was out there decided to come inside? I began sleeping in my car. It felt safer, even if only in the sense that it gave me some false sense of security. I parked about an acre away from the cabin, hoping that the distance would help. But it didn't. The footsteps still came. The breaking point came on a night I'll never forget. It was well past midnight, and I was reclining in the driver's seat with a blanket pulled over me. That's when I heard it again. Those slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. But this time, they didn't stop at the tree line. They kept coming. I sat up, barely breathing. The night was pitch black, with no moonlight to light the way. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. A twig snapped, and then, just outside my car, a low wheezing breath. My hand shook violently as I reached for my keys, nearly dropping them in my panic. When I turned the ignition, my headlights flashed on, but illuminated nothing. I slammed the car into reverse and floored it, getting out of there as fast as I could. By morning, I packed my things and left for good. My roommate, still convinced I was imagining things, stayed behind. But he didn't last long. Less than a month later, he was robbed twice. After the second robbery, he finally installed motion sensor cameras. What they captured made my stomach twist. A man with long, ragged hair had been hiding in the bushes, watching us, watching me. When I was around 8 years old, my father came up with the idea of taking us on a weekend trip to a cabin he wanted to rent in the mountains. My mother thought it was a wonderful plan, a chance to escape the routine and bond as a family. So that's exactly what we did. My parents, my sister, and I packed up the car early on a Friday morning, aiming to get a head start on the long, winding drive through the snow-dusted countryside. By the time we arrived, the cold hit me instantly. The air was crisp, and a thin layer of snow already covered the ground. It made sense since winter was just around the corner. We unloaded our bags, settled into the cozy wooden cabins, and chose our sleeping spots. After a hearty meal by the fire, we all went to bed excited about exploring the woods the next day. However, that night something strange happened. I was lying in bed when I heard something outside. It sounded like footsteps crunching through the snow. Curious, I peeked out the window but saw only dark, swaying trees. I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to sleep, but the footsteps came back about 15 minutes later. This time, I woke my sister, who was 10. We both crept to the window and, for a brief moment, saw a figure standing near the tree line. We couldn't make out any features, just a bulky shape. A wave of fear swept over me, and we quickly ducked below the window and whispered nervously. After a few moments, we decided it was best to ignore it and try to sleep again. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing with possible explanations. The next morning, I woke to the smell of sizzling bacon and the sound of my mother humming in the kitchen. I asked if I could go outside to help my father, who was already chopping wood near the cabin. My sister stayed inside, still groggy from our restless night. I ran outside and found my father talking to a man I'd never seen before. The stranger was short, stocky, with a shaved head and an old veteran's cap. His cheeks were flushed, and despite the freezing air, sweat beaded on his forehead. As I approached, my father looked at me and introduced me by name. The man smiled tightly and said, "Nice to meet you, kid. I'm Greg." He lingered on me a little too long, which made me uneasy. I blurted out, "You look kind of scared. Are you okay?" Greg cleared his throat and gave a forced smile. Yeah, just some stuff from my past," he said awkwardly. "I'm a veteran." My dad nodded sympathetically, and I didn't question it, though his nervous behavior unsettled me. Greg explained he was staying in a nearby cabin with his family and had come over to introduce himself. My father, always friendly, invited him inside for breakfast, which Greg accepted. He sat at the table and asked me questions about my hobbies and games. He seemed pleasant enough, but something still felt off. After breakfast, I went outside to play while my father continued chopping wood. At one point, I tripped and scraped my knee on a sharp rock. Tears streamed down my face as I examined the bloody scrape. Greg appeared out of nowhere, offering to help. "Come to my cabin. I've got bandages," he said. My dad was inside helping my mom, and I was too young and trusting to think twice. I followed Greg into the woods. We walked further than I expected, and the cold nipped at my cheeks while my knee throbbed. I asked how much further, and Greg just kept saying, "Just a bit more." After what felt like forever, we arrived at a small, run-down cabin. It didn't look like the well-maintained rentals I had seen earlier. "Where's your family?" I asked as we stepped inside. The air was musty, and clothes were scattered across the floor. Greg avoided the question for a while. "They're out for a walk," he said finally. "Come on, let me fix that knee." He knelt beside me and placed a bandage over the scrape. His hand lingered on my leg, rubbing it slowly. "You've got strong legs," he said with a strange smile. A cold chill washed over me. I stood up abruptly, mumbling that I needed to head back. But Greg's smile faltered as he stepped in front of the door. "No need to rush," he said. "Stay for some lunch." My heart raced as I scanned the room for another way out. "My parents will be looking for me," I said, but Greg waved a dismissive hand. "I told them you were with me," he lied. Just then, the door to a back room creaked open, and a pale woman with hollow eyes stepped out. She looked straight at me and whispered, "Help me." Before I could react, Greg spun around. "Get back inside," he snapped. The woman flinched and retreated into the room. Greg slammed the door shut and turned back to me with a cold smile. "Don't mind her. She's just sick." I bolted toward the door, yanked it open, and ran into the forest. I heard Greg shout and give chase. My heart hammered in my chest as I sprinted through the snow, branches whipping my face. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. Greg's heavy footsteps crunched behind me, growing louder as I pushed myself harder. After what felt like forever, I saw a familiar clearing. My father was standing outside the cabin, eyes wide when he saw me running toward him. "Greg!" I screamed, gasping for breath. "He's not a good guy. He tried to make me stay." My dad didn't ask questions. He rushed inside, called the local authorities, and grabbed an axe. The police arrived soon after, but by the time they reached Greg's cabin, it was empty. They found ropes, duct tape, and children's clothes that didn't belong to me. The woman was gone, and so was Greg. The police told us that the cabin hadn't been rented to anyone for months. We left that day. My father kept checking the rearview mirror as we drove home. The police never updated us with anything. We never learned who Greg really was, what happened to the woman, or how Greg ended up in that cabin. But I still have nightmares about that night. What started as just another My partner and I had just relocated to a small cabin at the foot of a mountain, nestled deep in the woods. It was our first night there, and there was no furniture yet, just an air mattress on the floor. The nearest neighbors were miles away, too distant to hear or see us from our place. Felt completely isolated. I was busy setting up the air mattress while my partner took a shower when the atmosphere around me suddenly shifted. A heavy electric tension filled the room, like the charge before a thunderstorm, making my skin tingle and the hairs on my arms stand up. Before I could react, the air mattress collapsed, the edges sticking to the floor, while the middle lifted up unnaturally. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to understand what was happening. Then I felt something. Turning to my right, I saw a glowing orb, the size of a volleyball, hovering at head height in the doorway. It wasn't a solid light. It shifted and swirled, like cells dividing under a microscope. The room felt thick, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. It was completely silent. I don't know how long I stared, maybe 5 seconds, maybe minutes, but suddenly, the orb shot toward me. I dove to the side, landing on the air mattress just as it passed inches from my head. Without slowing, it blasted through the closed window and disappeared into the woods. I lay there, my heart pounding, staring at the window, which was perfectly intact. No crack, no hole. It was as if the orb had never been there. I was too shaken to tell my partner that night. I sat there, replaying it in my mind over and over, my hands still trembling. Every night, we'd hear horrific, gut-wrenching screams from the woods just east of our cabin. They didn't sound like animals. They were human, but twisted, distorted. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask a guy who lived down the road if he'd ever heard them. He just shrugged and said, "Oh yeah, probably that woman who lives down there. She's off her meds." His nonchalant response unsettled me even more. Why would a supposedly homeless woman be screaming like that every night? And if it was her, why hadn't anyone done anything about it? Despite the oddities, I tried to make a life in the cabin. I had a hobby of panning for gold, and there was a creek just a short walk from our front door, one of the few things I genuinely liked about the place. One afternoon, I was down by the water, just off to the side of a small bridge, sifting through the sand, when an old truck pulled up. The driver, an older man in his late 50s or early 60s, looked worn out and serious. He rolled down his window and called out, "You got a gun on you?" I blinked, caught off guard. No, but I have bear spray." He didn't seem to care. "It's not the bears and cougars you need to worry about in these woods," he said, then drove off. I stood there, watching his taillights disappear, a chill creeping into my stomach. Years later, a friend introduced me to a podcast about the paranormal, mostly discussing Bigfoot and other strange phenomena. At first, I almost dismissed it as nonsense. But as I listened, I found that dozens of people described the exact same orb I had seen that night. I had always thought the idea of Sasquatch was a joke, just folklore, but now I'm not so sure. We ended up selling the property a few years later, but I still wonder who or what was out there. I grew up with my stepmother, Kate, in the 1970s. Kate's mom had moved their family to the United States when she was around 9 years old, all the way from England. They ended up in a pretty nice town where Kate went to a good high school. She quickly became friends with a girl named Sarah. Sarah wasn't exactly the type of person Kate usually hung out with, but they hit it off anyway. Sarah would take Kate out to do things she wouldn't normally do, like hiking, fishing, and sailing. Kate, who always had a look that seemed like she was upset with everything, wasn't thrilled with these activities at first. But over time, she found herself getting into it more and more. One Sunday, they decided to go hiking in some hills about an hour's drive from town. Kate put on what I'm sure were ridiculously expensive hiking boots, and the two of them set off for the trails. Sarah parked in a big clearing where some logs marked a makeshift parking space. There weren't any other cars there, which, as it turned out, was significant. They started hiking up the hill, veering off the main path since Sarah considered herself an adventurous type. It wasn't anything too extraordinary, though Kate kept complaining about how sticky and buggy it was. Once they reached the top, Kate, clearly fed up with the hike, groaned and decided it was time to head back down. Sarah reluctantly agreed, and they started their descent. After about 10 minutes, Kate began complaining again. Sarah finally gave in, and they decided to walk down the road instead of the rugged trail. Probably made them look ridiculous, but at least it was easier. No sooner had they started walking down the road than a rusty old truck pulled up beside them. The man driving it rolled down his window, revealing a guy with a scruffy beard, a baseball cap, and long brown hair. He greeted them with a smile and asked if they needed a ride. Kate thought he seemed charming and even a bit cute. Sarah, however, immediately felt uneasy, but despite her reservations, Kate managed to convince her to get in. It was only a short ride to the parking area, after all. They opened the passenger door and noticed the guy gestured for them to get into the back of the truck. Once they climbed in, the truck rumbled to life and started moving. Almost immediately, Sarah began to feel like they had made a huge mistake. The back seat, while clean, had a rope on the floor behind the driver's seat, and underneath the passenger seat were several half-open boxes of plastic wrap. It felt off, but Sarah didn't want to alarm Kate, so she kept her thoughts to herself. As they drove on for what seemed longer than expected, the woods didn't seem to be clearing up, and they hadn't seen another car. Sarah asked the driver how much longer it would be. He explained he was taking a different route down and had to make a quick stop somewhere first. Sarah, who was 16 at the time, didn't press the issue, though she was becoming more uneasy the longer they were on the road. Several minutes later, they came to a tiny cabin in the middle of a clearing. There was an old stump outside, and an axe was stuck in a nearby log. Sarah's alarm bells were going off now. The guy stopped the truck, turned off the engine, and got out. He told them to stay in the truck, saying he would be right back, and then disappeared into the cabin. Sarah tried to talk to Kate, urging her to leave, but Kate was dismissive of her concerns. The situation only got more tense as Sarah began to argue more forcefully. Reluctantly, Kate agreed to get out, and they walked around the truck. The cabin was only about 50 yards away, but something about the situation felt wrong. They debated what to do. If the guy was genuinely trying to help them, it would be rude to just leave. But at the same time, they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Kate, ever conscious of manners, started heading back toward the truck, intending to get in. Sarah, frustrated and terrified, followed her. That's when Sarah noticed something that made her heart stop. A large hatchet, with dried blood on the blade, was lying half hidden on the floor under the driver's seat. It was stained red and brown, and it was obvious that it hadn't been used for anything good. Panicking, Sarah grabbed Kate, and they ran off into the woods, heading in the direction they hoped would take them back down the hill. They stumbled through the trees for a while, with Kate crying the entire time. Sarah felt terrible for her, but also worried about what might happen if the man heard them. They finally found their way back to the bottom and saw the old wooden fence surrounding the parking area. They felt a wave of relief wash over them, but as they got closer, they saw the truck parked across the clearing, facing the opposite direction. It was eerily still, and they couldn't tell if anyone was inside. Kate wanted to make a run for the car, but Sarah insisted they wait. After all, it was the 1970s. There were no cell phones, no rangers, and no help nearby. The parking lot was huge and empty, and if they rushed across it, they didn't know what could happen. Sarah convinced Kate to stay hidden behind a tree with her, and they waited for what seemed like hours. As darkness began to fall and the sounds of animals started filling the air, Kate grew more anxious. Sarah, exhausted and on edge, was just about to make a break for it when they heard a noise. From across the lot, they saw the back door of their car swing open. The man slid out of the back seat, looked around, and then walked back to his truck. He drove away, and Sarah waited a few minutes before she and Kate sprinted to the car, jumping in and speeding off as fast as they could, not even bothering to close the doors properly. If that man is still alive today, he'd be very old. But neither Sarah nor Kate ever wanted to see him again. I moved into a rundown cabin a long way from the nearest town. The drive to the place was desolate, a stretch of winding roads that seemed to swallow every sign of civilization. No one passed through unless they had a reason to, and out here there weren't many reasons to be. From the moment I arrived, something didn't sit right. The solar power barely worked, so I spent my nights in complete darkness except for the faint glow of my headlamp and the occasional flash of moonlight. The nights seemed to drag on forever, suffocating, leaving me unable to sleep. At first, it was the bats that kept me awake. Dozens of them wrestled in the rafters, their claws scratching and their high-pitched screeches making it impossible to rest. Then something else, something heavier, footsteps on the porch. The first time I heard them, I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a badger or a beaver, but deep down I knew better. Badgers don't move slowly, deliberately, and they don't pause as if they're listening and waiting. 2 months passed and the scratching started. It began at the edges of the deck, then got closer, moving to the door. Something was testing the cabin. Every time I stepped outside, the air felt thick, and the trees seemed unnaturally dark and towering, pressing in, as if hiding something just out of my sight. I started keeping my shotgun nearby, even though I wasn't supposed to have one out here. But who in their right mind would live alone in the woods and not arm themselves? Tuesdays were my grocery days, the only time I'd leave the cabin after dark. The drive back was always tense, with my headlights barely cutting through the pitch-black woods. This particular night, I felt it before I even pulled into the driveway. A wrongness deep in my gut, like a warning. Something was waiting for me. I stepped out of the truck, keys in hand, and then I saw them. 2 eyes, hovering in the darkness just above my front door. Too high to be a coyote, but too low to be a deer, about 4 feet off the ground, and they weren't moving. My heart skipped a beat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to jump back in the truck and drive away. I yelled out, hoping it would go away, but the eyes stayed fixed. Slowly, They lowered and began to creep forward. I grabbed a piece of firewood from the pile and threw it. The log hit the ground with a thud, and the creature flinched back but remained silent. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my keys as I fumbled to unlock the door. The solar power was out again, so I was doing this blind. I could hear its breathing, slow and controlled. Too steady to be an animal, too aware of its surroundings. I finally made it inside and grabbed my shotgun. When I stepped back out, it was still there, but closer now, just at the edge of my headlamp's weak glow. My pulse thundered in my ears as I loaded the gun, never taking my eyes off it. One-handed, I threw another piece of firewood. It moved slowly, then melted back into the shadows. No sound, no rush of movement, just gone. That night, I drank 4 beers and slept with my shotgun in my arms. Morning came, and I wasn't sure if I had imagined the whole thing until the trail crew arrived. They found mountain lion tracks all over the porch, near the rocking chair, and circling the cabin. But even after that night, I kept hearing it. The creak of the rocking chair late at night, footsteps on the deck. I'd grab my shotgun, throw open the door, and see nothing. No movement, no sound. And when I checked the ground, there were never any new tracks. The mud had been wet for weeks. There should have been tracks. I've been stalked by mountain lions before. They watch you from a distance, keeping to the shadows. They don't taunt you. They don't play games with you. But whatever this was, it wasn't a mountain lion. It was definitely playing with me,